In the middle of a busy Japanese city, there was this guy just walking around staring at his phone. He was low-key bored out of his mind. Same old end-of-year routine. Nothing exciting ever happened. Then, out of nowhere, this weird notification popped up on his screen, offering him a trip to another world. He didn't even get a chance to process what that meant before everything went sideways. A car horn blared, someone screamed a warning, and suddenly, chaos was everywhere. It all happened so fast. A huge truck came barreling straight at him, and he had zero time to dodge. The impact was brutal. 1 second there was screaming and people freaking out, calling for an ambulance. The next, he was just lying there on the ground, completely still. As his consciousness started fading, he felt his bones give out, and one thought crept in. Is this really it? When his eyes opened again, the pain was just gone. Instead, there was this old bearded man sitting calmly in front of him. He was beyond confused, but the old man didn't sugarcoat it. Yeah, you're dead. The memory of the truck hit him all over again, making it all feel way too real. Turns out he was in some totally foreign place, clouds stretching out as far as he could see in every direction. The old man warned him not to move around too much, or he'd fall right off. And then, in the middle of trying to wrap his head around all this, the guy introduced himself as God. The young man just froze, confused and honestly, a little suspicious. He remembered something his late grandma used to say: never trust anyone who claims to be God. That reaction clearly hit a nerve with the deity, who looked a bit offended. Things got awkward real fast when the god figure admitted there'd been a mistake on his end. The god asked for his name, Sansui it turned out, and that's when the truth came out. God had accidentally snuffed out Sansui's life candle way earlier than he was supposed to. As an apology, he offered to send Sansui to another world, instead of just letting him stay dead. Sansui was all in. The god even promised to hook him up with a special power so he could actually survive over there, and told him he could ask for whatever he wanted. Without hesitating for a second, Sansui said he wanted to be the strongest person in the world. God thought that was a little embarrassing and way too ambitious, but granted it anyway. The catch? Instead of an instant power-up, he handed Sansui a letter of recommendation and told him to find someone who'd train him. Sansui complained. Why did he have to go through training at all? God told him flat out that training is just part of getting strong, and before Sansui could argue any further, he straight up shoved him off the cloud. Sansui's protests faded as he fell right through the clouds below. He landed in the middle of some unfamiliar forest. Clutching the letter from God, he started calling out into the trees, hoping whoever was supposed to train him would show up soon. Out of nowhere, another young guy appeared, casually standing on top of a super thin branch, like it was nothing. Sansui's jaw dropped. How was that even physically possible? The mysterious figure looked Sansui over and decided he wasn't a threat. Then he casually dropped the news that the nearest village was 7 days away on foot. Not exactly what Sansui wanted to hear. Putting two and two together, Sansui figured this had to be his future teacher. He pulled out the letter from God and handed it over respectfully. The guy in the traditional outfit took it and started reading carefully while Sansui stood there, stomach doing flips. After reading it, he let out a long, slow breath, the kind that said someone just dumped their problem on me. But he agreed to take Sansui on as his student. He then asked if Sansui knew what a Kenshi, or sword saint, was. Sansui just shook his head. His new teacher explained he'd be teaching the fighting style used by sages. He was very upfront that the training was going to be brutal. Sansui was already second-guessing himself. The teacher didn't hold back. He said straight up that he saw zero natural talent in Sansui, but he promised that within about 500 years, Sansui would definitely become the strongest. That number made Sansui yell. He'd be dead of old age before that ever happened. His teacher calmed him down, explaining that while training under him, Sansui wouldn't have to worry about aging. The man himself had been training for thousands of years and still didn't feel like he was done. And so the training began. His teacher shot through the forest like a blur, weaving between trees effortlessly, until they reached a small, simple hut, their new home. Sansui arrived gasping for breath, absolutely wiped out from trying to keep up. His teacher explained he'd been using a body lightning technique and promised Sansui would eventually master it too. Sansui just hung his head. The long, exhausting journey had barely even started. A wooden sword changed hands, and with it came an instruction that sounded simple but felt incredibly heavy. The training didn't require any fancy technique. Just swing the sword every single day from sunrise to sunset. One rule: don't stop until told to. Behind the simplicity, his teacher stressed one thing above everything else: the will to keep swinging, no matter what. With a push to someday become the strongest, the 500-year training arc officially kicked off. The early days were genuinely rough. This new world demanded crazy physical endurance. Every dawn, he'd be out there swinging alongside his teacher Suiboku. That routine repeated until night, only to start all over again the next morning. Slowly, the hunger he used to feel just stopped being a thing. His teacher explained that a sage could survive just by breathing in air and natural energy, no food needed. With no other option, he kept at it day after day, absorbing everything his teacher threw at him. Without even noticing, his old school uniform had worn out completely and been replaced by clothing just like his teacher's. The years blurred together. All that time somehow felt like it passed in the blink of an eye. Even after 500 years, he still felt like he couldn't match his teacher. But right in the middle of wrestling with that feeling, an unfamiliar presence suddenly showed up in the forest, something that had never happened the entire time he'd been there. The two of them immediately moved toward it. His teacher sensed two weak presences, and it seemed like they were being cornered by a pack of wolves. They needed to move fast. Unfortunately, they were a little too late to save the mother. Behind the trees was a devastating scene, but amid the silence, there was still one small flicker of hope. Against all odds, the baby had survived. Seeing that, his teacher made a suggestion that completely blindsided him. He asked his student to try raising the child. Sansui had no idea what to do with that. His teacher explained that while the baby had magical potential, she had no path to becoming a sage, so raising her in the human world was the best option. It wasn't just some random task. It was part of his training, a way to gain life experience, both as a sage and as a swordsman. His teacher believed 500 years of training had given Sansui more than enough strength. With genuine pride, he sent his student, Sansui, off to begin the next chapter. But there was one hard rule: he couldn't come back to this forest until he'd raised the child properly. A huge responsibility now rested on his shoulders, though for a sage, however long that took, would feel like nothing at all. They said their goodbyes with deep mutual respect. Cradling the baby, Sansui made a silent promise to raise her right. He wasn't about to embarrass his teacher's legacy. And just like that, a new life began. As he walked out of the forest that had been his home for centuries, he started wondering how strong he actually was now and what was waiting for him out there. But first things first, he needed a job, because this baby had to eat. The first problem hit immediately when the baby started wailing at the top of her lungs. Sansui panicked. He had absolutely no idea what to do. He'd never dealt with anything like this before. Realizing he obviously couldn't breastfeed, he needed a quick fix. Luckily, his heightened senses picked up a village in the distance. Maybe he'd find a nursing mother there who could help. When he got there, he spun a little story, told them he was a widower who just lost his wife and was struggling financially. It worked. A kind village woman agreed to nurse the poor baby. Once the baby was calm and full, the woman gave him some practical advice. Since he was young, she suggested heading to the capital. Opportunities in a small village like this were basically non-existent. As he looked in the direction she pointed, it hit him just how foreign the outside world felt. 500 years isolated in that forest had left him completely in the dark about how the kingdom even worked right now. A small voice in the back of his head wondered, could he really pull this off alone? As a parting gift, the village woman gave him a bag of goat's milk for the road. He thanked her from the bottom of his heart and headed out. The woman's friendliness had been a little intense, but honestly, he was just grateful. The journey to the capital had officially begun. After saying a genuine goodbye, he hurried off with the baby held close. He really hoped he'd get a chance to repay her kindness someday. But mid-journey through the quiet road, he caught the sound of carriage wheels rolling in from a distance. Without thinking, he leaped, launching himself clean over the speeding carriage in one massive jump. The coachman and guards nearly had a heart attack. They stood there arguing about whether that was a bird or a wind mage, while the man himself just thought, jumping is way faster than running anyway. But they weren't about to let it slide. One of the guards hollered at him to stop. He turned around looking genuinely confused, only to realize something was chasing him down. The fancy carriage stopped, and a knight in full uniform marched up with a sharp glare. The The knight seemed both impressed and furious, demanding to know if he was a wind mage. In a stiff tone, he laid into Sansui for having the nerve to jump over a noble's carriage. Sansui honestly didn't think he'd even touched it, but he stayed quiet while the knight threatened serious punishment, only to back off when he noticed the baby. Instead, the knight demanded a direct apology to his lord. Sansui accepted without much fuss and was walked over to the carriage door where the lord was already waiting at the window. Inside sat a noble girl with an icy stare, confirming he was the one who jumped over them. The knight confirmed it and immediately told Sansui to get on with the apology. With an awkward smile, Sansui apologized and explained he was just a country guy who didn't know noble etiquette. Rather than being sympathetic, the girl called him a rough, rude man with no manners, compared him to a dirty monkey in beat-up clothes. But seeing the baby in his arms, she decided to let it go. Just as the carriage was about to take off again, the girl suddenly stopped and looked back. Something sparked her curiosity out of nowhere, and she asked who he actually was. He introduced himself as Shirokuro Sansui with a cheerful tone. The name was clearly unusual for the region, and it caught her interest. Noticing he seemed to have no place to go, she surprised him with a job offer at her estate, as long as he could pass an entrance test. He lit up. He felt incredibly lucky that someone was willing to hire a scruffy guy like him. Meanwhile, the knight looked like he was going to pass out from disbelief. His lord was seriously just picking up a random stranger off the road. With full confidence, the girl introduced herself as Duvet. She told him to remember the name of his future employer and made sure he felt the weight of that title. The knight, Brower, tried to protest one more time. This felt beneath her dignity. But Duvet had already made up her mind. She then asked Sansui to show her his palms, and he held them out, curious. After looking them over, Duvet could tell immediately. Those were the hands of someone who'd been gripping a sword for a very long time. Internally, Sansui just laughed to himself. If she knew how long he'd actually been doing this, nobody would believe him. But her examination continued. She pointed out that Sansui had absolutely no magical energy flowing through his body, which made Brower genuinely shocked. They started theorizing about how someone without magic could possibly jump that high, landing on the idea of a rare magic. Sansui just listened quietly, realizing for the first time that in this world, nearly everyone could use magic. Those who couldn't typically relied on complicated rituals or ceremonies to pull off similar effects. Sansui figured his sage arts were probably being interpreted as some kind of rare magic by the people here. Duvet made clear that her job offer was only on the table if he could actually prove his abilities. For Sansui, just being given a shot was more than enough. The journey continued until they finally reached the capital's gate, and it was massive. Sansui couldn't help but stare, completely in awe of the enormous iron gate protecting the city. His obvious amazement made Brower genuinely confused. This guy seemed more impressed by a city gate than by his lord's appearance. Duvet was just relieved to be back in the capital, already missing her father and older brother. Meanwhile, Sansui, who'd spent 500 years in a whole other world, felt like this was finally the start of the real fantasy adventure he'd been waiting for. The carriage eventually pulled up in front of the Dewey family's impressive estate. A line of servants was already waiting at the front door to welcome them back. Sansui stepped out with a mix of emotions swirling in his chest, knowing his life was about to change in this place. Duvet told the servants to show the monkey she'd picked up to a room in her usual blunt fashion, but the calm was immediately shattered when the baby started crying her lungs out. A senior servant swooped in and took the baby to soothe her, and Sansui couldn't stop thanking everyone. Inside the mansion, Duvet was greeted by her father and older brother, both of whom had a strong commanding presence. From across the room, Sansui could already sense the aura of seasoned warriors coming off both men. Duvet, cool as ever, introduced Sansui to her family as the wild monkey she'd found on the road. And just like that, Sansui's new life in the capital began. The young lady's plan to take this stranger on as her personal guard because of his rare magic triggered a reaction nobody expected. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly, her father and brother practically seething. They couldn't wrap their heads around it. How could someone who looked this weak possibly protect their precious daughter and sister? Her brother especially took it as a straight-up insult, like this guy had a death wish. In the middle of the chaos, Sansui just calmly asked them to settle down and hear him out first. But the emotions had already taken over. Without any warning, both of them lunged forward with a battle cry. Sansui had a brief moment of panic before resigning himself there was no talking his way out of this. With fast, precise movements, he took them both down in seconds. 2 clean hits, and they hit the floor before they even knew what happened. Sansui immediately apologized, keeping his head down despite being the one who just won. Sansui felt a little guilty. Had using the wooden sword been the right call, or was it overkill? The young lady, on the other hand, looked genuinely impressed. She'd found someone way more capable than she'd expected. Her father, still not over it, yelled and demanded to know who exactly this guy was that just embarrassed him like that. The baby, crying in the middle of everything, snapped the father back to reality a little. There was clearly a longer story here. Still cranky, he demanded his daughter explain why this man needed to be under their roof. The father softened slightly, though not without a dig. Sansui should be grateful it was the baby that saved his neck. They moved out to the mansion's wide courtyard for a more serious test. Sansui found himself wondering how things had escalated this far. The father warned that real enemies targeting his daughter would come armed and hit without warning, so he challenged Sansui to fight in unfavorable conditions against his son, now wearing full armor. The young lady held firm on her word and wasn't pulling back her offer to hire Sansui. Her father admitted the rare magic was interesting, but without actual combat ability, it meant nothing. Sansui was starting to realize this test was really just their excuse to take him out with full force. Before the duel started, Sansui asked the baby's name. Rain, it turned out. Things got a little funny when the nanny told Rain to say goodbye to her daddy, as if Sansui definitely wasn't coming back alive. The orders from the father were harsh. He told his son to make Sansui suffer before finishing him off. The brother, fiercely protective of his sister, swore he wouldn't let any man get near her and that he'd show no mercy. Sansui just stood there taking it in, a combination of an overprotective dad and a brother with a full-on obsession. The terms were brutal. Sansui had to defeat a fully armored opponent using only his wooden sword in a single strike. Only then would he and Rain be allowed to stay. Without wasting any time, the brother fired himself up, screaming for his sister's honor. His fighting spirit blazed as he charged full force. Unlike his opponent, who was raging, Sansui stayed completely still, settling into a rock-solid stance, as if time itself had slowed down around him. With perfect spiritual balance swordsmanship, Sansui released one precisely targeted strike. The impact of his wooden sword produced a thunderous crack that tore straight through the armor's defenses. His opponent dropped instantly. The father stood frozen, stunned that his pride and joy had been taken out in a single hit. The young lady, watching from a distance, just thought Sansui's fighting style was too plain and boring. Even if the result was incredible, the father still couldn't accept it, muttering about how a fully armored knight lost to a wooden sword. The young lady was starting to notice that the sword in Sansui's hand moved like it was literally part of his body. But her father's pride reared back up. He refused to accept this reality and felt like the family's honor was on the line. He wasn't going to stand for it and still refused to let Sansui become his daughter's guard. Catching Sansui slightly off guard, the father went for a surprise attack, thinking he saw an opening. It didn't work. The move was way too slow for Sansui, who deflected it easily and sent the father tumbling to the ground too. Watching her father and brother fall one after the other, the young lady couldn't help but throw some sarcastic shade at them both. Done listening to their complaints, she officially announced that from this point on, Sansui was her personal guard. Sansui expressed his deep appreciation for the opportunity. Meanwhile, Brow, the female knight on staff, couldn't help noticing that Sansui didn't seem even remotely tired after taking on two tough opponents. A sweet little moment broke through when Rain was brought over. The nanny cheerfully showed Rain that her daddy was alive and well, and Rain responded with the most adorable laugh. Sansui felt a deep sense of relief. He'd finally found a safe, decent place for Rain to grow up. Even though things had gotten weird, he was genuinely glad the job had fallen into his lap like this. Still, somewhere in the back of his mind, Sansui had a nagging bad feeling about his new life at the mansion. Turns out he was right. The young lady of the Dewey family was not your typical calm, graceful noblewoman. Beneath that pretty smile was someone wildly eccentric and occasionally dangerous. Sansui had to stay on his toes at all times. Her impatience had a way of turning into extreme actions. One time, when Sansui mentioned that a sage couldn't be burned, she immediately tested it by setting him on fire. Same thing when she heard a sage couldn't drown. She dunked him straight into the pond without a second thought, purely out of curiosity. Her selfish streak, always needing things done her way, made total sense, given how high up the social ladder she was. In the Kingdom of Arcana, there were 4 major noble houses beneath the royal family, and she came from the highly influential House Spade. On top of that, with a super protective older brother and a father who ran the household, nobody could rein in her whims. Despite having to deal with all her bizarre behavior, the main reason Sansui stuck around was Rain. Plain and simple, the prestigious Spade family actually treated Rain incredibly well, raising her to be a polite, well-educated little girl. For Sansui, who felt like all he could do was swing a sword, watching his daughter grow up with real opportunities felt like an absolute blessing. He couldn't imagine finding a better place to raise her, and honestly, the young lady herself was crazy fond of Rain. On the other side of things, Brow, who'd initially doubted Sansui, turned out to be an incredibly mature and composed female knight. Brow proved to be a powerful magic knight who always gave 100% on the job. She was strict and professional, but she also had a warm, friendly side when it came to Sansui. Their relationship kept getting better, even after the incident where the young lady's brother showed up with an entire elite squad trying to reclaim his lost honor. Sansui personally preferred not to get into the details of what happened to that elite squad. Time flew by, and before he knew it, 5 years had passed. Life at the Spade Mansion, colorful as it was, had changed a lot of things, binding them all together in something that went way beyond employer and bodyguard. The elegant carriage finally rolled up to the estate, welcomed warmly by everyone waiting outside. It turned into an emotional moment when little Ray came sprinting out and threw herself into her father's arms. The joy in her voice said everything. She'd missed him so much and was finally back where she belonged. In the middle of that warm reunion, Brow appeared to check whether all the departure preparations were done. Sansui confirmed they were good to go. The young lady couldn't even hide how pumped she was. She felt like it was finally time to leave her parents' home and head to the Royal Academy with everything she had. And off they went. Inside the moving carriage, the young lady started getting impatient and asked how much longer the trip would take. Brow explained that they'd stay overnight around here and should arrive at the academy by tomorrow afternoon. But the young lady's curiosity quickly shifted to the possibility of running into bandits along the way. Sansui mentioned there was a mountain range known as a bandit hotspot not far from where they were. Instead of being worried, she thought that sounded kind of exciting. Even after Brow begged her to stay inside the carriage if an ambush happened, she flat out refused. Sitting in a carriage was just as boring as sitting at home, she said. Sitting nearby, Line was starting to visibly stress out. Noticing Line's anxiety, Brow tried to reassure her, pointing out that both she and Sansui's father were strong, so there was nothing to worry about. Sansui stayed quiet, used to the young lady's unreasonable demands by now. Brow, if she was being honest with herself, just saw a potential ambush as extra hassle on an already long day. Night fell, and the carriage pushed deeper into the dark forest of the mountain pass. The atmosphere got heavier, and Line couldn't keep her fear under wraps anymore. Sansui gently tried to comfort the little girl. He completely understood why the silence of the night forest felt so threatening to her. Then Sansui's instincts kicked in. He could feel enemies closing in, and they were close. Brow immediately asked for a number, and Sansui calmly answered, about 20. The young lady's eyes lit up. Brow took charge, telling her to stay back while she dealt with the bandits. Sansui shouted to the coachman to stop the carriage and told everyone inside to lock the doors immediately. The moment their feet hit the ground, a gang of bandits poured out from behind the trees, surrounding the carriage. Tension spiked as the enemy stepped into view, weapons drawn, ready to take down anyone in their way. Sansui sized them up. They looked like mercenaries who'd fallen on hard times, clearly starving. Brow called out with authority, making it clear she was a knight of House Spade. It didn't faze them at all. These guys were way past caring about crests or titles. Without hesitating, Brow launched her wind magic. With elegant but deadly precision, she unleashed Wind Slide, sending razor-sharp blades of air slicing through the crowd. She declared herself the one who would bring judgment to anyone who dared challenge House Spade. The bandits were caught off guard, realizing they were up against a mage. They scrambled to warn each other to stop her from casting again. Too late. With full authority, Brow made it clear death was the only outcome for those who challenged House Spade's honor. Brow's power was something else entirely. She could even levitate, a skill so rare even most mages never pulled it off. The bandits started panicking, realizing they had no shot against someone this powerful. Meanwhile, a few of them tried to sneak around and grab the people inside the carriage as hostages. Sansui stepped right into their path. Calmly, he introduced himself as swordsman Shirokuro Sansui. With no wasted movement, he deployed his chi sword technique to neutralize the approaching threats. minutes. His attack was so fast and unexpected, the bandits couldn't even process what hit them. With one powerful burst from his chi release technique, he sent a wave of energy slamming into his opponents, launching them off their feet, wrapping things up with ruthless efficiency. The fight was over before it really started. Brow stood proud under the moonlight after sweeping up the last of the enemies. The young lady stepped out of the carriage and remarked that Brow was as impressive as always, while Sansui's style was too plain. Brow still apologized. The darkness had kept her from performing at her absolute best. The young lady was a little disappointed the entertainment had ended so quickly, then ordered everyone back inside to keep moving. Inside the carriage, the mood settled as Line exhaled in relief. Sansui and Brow just exchanged a look and sighed, both wishing their lady could at least appreciate that they'd just kept her safe. Finally, the grand building of the Royal Arcana Academy came into view. Sansui had to admit, it was way more impressive than he'd imagined. He could literally feel the dense magical energy radiating from the whole area. But for Line, nothing would ever top the young lady's home. Their arrival was met by a distinguished older woman who turned out to be the headmaster. The young lady greeted her as Grand Sage, but the woman humbly asked to just be called headmaster, with a small jab at the young lady's ego thrown in, calling her a spoiled princess. Their exchange had a familiar sharpness to it, but stayed formal. The headmaster explained that the title of Magus was just something that came with old age. The young lady offered a respectful greeting, asking for guidance during her time there. Watching from behind, Sansui got the impression that despite how pointed their words sounded, these two actually got along just fine. The headmaster then turned her attention to Sansui. She admitted being extremely curious about the sage arts his lady's bodyguard possessed, a discipline so rare she'd never even heard of it. She asked Sansui to demonstrate it for the students. That request put Sansui in an awkward spot. 500 years of training, and honestly, he'd only ever mastered 4 basic techniques: a light step technique that reduced the weight of his body or anything he touched, a flash movement technique for covering distance in an instant, an energy blade technique that made his sword as hard as steel, and a Kai release technique that created a powerful shockwave on impact. 500 years in, and to him, all of it still felt completely ordinary, nothing flashy about it. His employer, of course, understood that perfectly, which was exactly why she'd never asked him to show it off in public. But the mood shifted fast when a representative from the Batrable family showed up with that dismissive energy, clearly there to flex on behalf of their people. Full of confidence, he proposed turning the gathering into an exhibition match. The idea was approved on the spot. Sansui internally sighed. He'd seen this coming from a mile away. The Royal Arcana Academy Stadium now served as the stage for two sides squaring off. Surrounded by the grandeur of the arena, the tension between those about to show what they were made of was already building. Happine Batrable, heir to a noble house on par with House Seped, started throwing out cutting remarks right away. With a condescending air, she claimed she could barely remember their last meeting, implying their opponent simply wasn't worth remembering. His employer had serious pride and always needed to come out on top in front of her peers. On the other side, the Batrable crew looked locked in, each one sitting on a rare power they were clearly itching to show off. Sansui's attention drifted to a Japanese guy in the group. His attitude felt a little too casual for someone talking to the heir of a major noble house, and those clothes and shoes, way too modern. They stuck out like a sore thumb here. Turns out he wasn't just a regular magic user. He had the unfair ability to use every type of magic there was. And now, all eyes shifted to center stage as the crowd noise started building. The first demonstration was by Tsunai Majan, a princess from a distant kingdom. She called upon the royal power of the mythological bloodline flowing through her, invoking the strength of her kingdom's founder to transform into something terrifying. In an instant, her body was engulfed in massive energy as she shifted into a powerful beast. This was the secret technique, divine possession, passed down through her family for generations. The crowd and the announcer were stunned, watching a rare magic like this on display. Tsunai looked extremely satisfied by everyone's reaction, practically glowing with pride over what she'd just shown off. Next up, Zuga Sabe stepped forward to demonstrate her curse magic. Unlike regular magic, she could generate curse energy capable of completely changing the properties of an object. With a single touch, a sword that had been hard and solid went limp like a ribbon, leaving everyone watching completely floored. This technique, and passed down from her ancestors, absolutely owned the room. While some found the previous technique underwhelming, the stadium energy surged right back up when the main event was announced. The person said to be the greatest swordsman in the land was about to step into the arena. The pressure was massive on both sides. His employer demanded an absolute win to protect the family's reputation, while the other side was just as fired up to back their champion. Sansui could feel the weight of everyone's expectations hanging in the air. Up in the stands, the crowd was on edge, all of them wanting to find out who actually deserved to be called the strongest. His name was called as the representative of House Supade, the Sword Saint with a kid's face. Honestly, the nickname made sense. His face hadn't aged a single day in the past 500 years, though being called that out loud was still a little embarrassing. On the other side, Mizu Seiga stepped up as the opponent. Turns out he was Hapine's fiancé, and those girls who'd just shown off their magic abilities were also somehow tangled up in his personal life. Looking at the setup, Sansui couldn't help but think of the word harem from the stories, but he wasn't going to underestimate the guy. Seiga immediately started stacking support magic, layering healing spells and a magical shield all over his body. With his magical gear up and sword drawn, he announced he was ready. Sansui drew his blade too, prepared for whatever was coming. Sansui studied his opponent carefully, noting that so far the armored young man had only been giving off one type of energy. To him, that was a sign the guy probably wouldn't be pulling out any other type of magic beyond the support spells. Despite what the Magus had made sound impressive, Sansui suspected the rest was just a closely held secret. Judging by his stance and how he was holding the sword, Sansui clocked him as a straight-up amateur, someone who didn't even know how to properly grip a weapon, with a magical defense shield that looked completely paper-thin. With all eyes on the arena, Sansui mapped out how to end this fast. A flash step followed by an energy blade strike aimed straight at the armor. One solid hit should be enough to knock him out cold. But at that same moment, his opponent felt something off. A gut feeling, a small twitch of instinct that put him slightly on edge. The guy started wondering if Sansui could read his mind or even see the future. He hadn't even finished processing that thought when Sansui was already moving, at a speed that was nearly impossible to track. Despite being caught completely off guard, the armored young man barely managed to throw up a defensive stance at the last second as the strike came in. Sansui wasn't about to let the momentum die. Seeing his opponent had blocked the sword, he immediately closed the gap and drove a sharp palm strike forward. Channeling a massive burst of chi release in an instant, he slammed his raw energy directly into his opponent's chest while he was still locked in that defensive posture. The impact sent a shockwave ripping through the air, throwing his opponent's body hard into the arena wall, cracking it on contact. In an instant, the young man crumpled, completely out cold. Sansui stood there, calm as ever, and simply said, "This fight is done." Silence fell over the crowd. The movement had been too fast for most of them to even see. Then, cutting through the stunned quiet, a little girl came running with pure joy on her face, throwing herself at her father. Meanwhile, the young lady watching from the stands just smiled quietly, admitting that as plain as Sansui always looked, the things he could actually do were completely beyond explanation. After the match, Sansui explained that his opponent had actually read the attack and blocked early, which was exactly why he'd switched up the pattern mid-move. He figured the kid probably had a whole arsenal of God-given abilities, but was seriously lacking in the basics. His opponent's teammates panicked and rushed him off to the medical room. The young lady, meanwhile, looked completely entertained, feeling like the trip to the academy had already paid off just from witnessing something that interesting. When Seiga came to in the medical room, he just lay there stewing in his loss. The humiliation of being put down like that in front of everyone was eating him alive. His friends tried to cheer him up, some even throwing out accusations that the other side had cheated. But Seiga knew his own capabilities. He hadn't gone full throttle. He'd held back because he was scared of revealing his secret. But now the drive to beat Sansui was burning hotter than ever, even if it meant risking everything he'd been hiding. To understand what was going on, you had to know the rules of this world, where everyone was generally born with just one type of power, and no amount of hard work could change that. Those with magic essence could typically only handle natural elements, like fire, water, wind, or earth. Then there were rare abilities, sage arts that could manipulate space and gravity, royal hearts that let the user transform into a powerful beast, and curse magic that could alter the physical properties of objects around them. There was also holy magic, used for shields and healing. The ironclad rule was this: unless you were some kind of once-in-a-generation prodigy, you simply could not use any type of magic outside your natural gift. Seiga's situation was completely different. Just like Sansui, he used to be an ordinary guy from Japan who lost his life because of a mistake from the higher-ups, and as a way to make up for it, he was given a special ability and sent into the same world as Sansui. The thing is, what he received wasn't just special, it was way over the top. He had access to multiple kinds of magical energy, things like magic essence, a royal heart, curse energy, even something tied to wisdom, and somehow he could already use several types of magic at the same time, which by this world's standards already felt unfair. On top of that, he had fire magic, defensive holy armor, transformation into a higher state, and even a rare kind of foresight that let him catch glimpses of what might happen next, a power that was supposed to be long gone, so honestly, none of it really made sense. Even so, Sega chose to keep a low profile, holding himself back in public and only using holy magic because he didn't want to attract attention, and deep down, he knew he still needed time to properly master everything he had. But reality didn't go the way he expected, because in the rematch the next day, he finally went all out, and still, it ended almost instantly. His friends could only watch in shock as Sansui kept up with him effortlessly, moving at a pace that didn't feel realistic at all. From Sansui's point of view, the problem was obvious. Seiga was too confident, relying too much on his defense and speed, rushing in without thinking, and that small mistake was enough. Sansui barely needed to do anything, just a slight adjustment in angle, and Seiga lost control of his own movement, running straight into Sansui's blade and dropping on the spot. For the young lady, the whole thing felt both satisfying and uncomfortable to watch, and she didn't hide it, calling Seiga's performance embarrassing and a complete waste of time, even pointing out coldly that letting such a weak opponent drag things out like that reflected poorly on Sansui as her bodyguard. Sansui apologized sincerely, but his employer seemed more confused than anything, like she was trying to understand what Rain's mother ever saw in him. And as she kept observing him, one detail stood out. Sansui hadn't aged at all since the first time they met. Even though they looked about the same age, he admitted the gap between them was much bigger than it seemed, and that only made her more curious, to the point she casually asked if he had any interest in women, especially since he and Rain weren't related by blood. The question caught him off guard, and she teased him, saying someone with such a calm, unreadable face must be hiding something deeper underneath, something more human. But Sansui quickly defended himself, explaining that his intense training had helped him suppress those kinds of desires, which only made Brower, who overheard it, turn bright red. For her, his complete lack of interest in romance felt strange, almost concerning, while the young lady just found it amusing, though there was still a quiet tension behind Brower's clenched fist, something she couldn't quite explain, but definitely felt. Time passed quickly, and before they knew it, a full month had gone by since Lady Dewey arrived at the academy. And in class, Sansui found himself a bit surprised because she was actually keeping up with the lessons more seriously than he expected, since he had assumed she would get bored almost immediately. That day, they were discussing failed magical experiments, including the story of a fire mage who met a tragic end while trying to create a defensive spell, and instead of reacting seriously, the young lady laughed, which Sansui felt was a bit inappropriate. At the same time, Brower found her thoughts drifting, realizing that Rain had reached the age where feelings toward the opposite sex start to develop, something she herself was beginning to experience too, which only made things more awkward since both Rain and the young lady kept teasing them about it. And not long after, they moved to another Dewey residence, a mansion chosen for its proximity to the academy. One day, Brower quietly apologized, admitting she hadn't been fully focused on her duties lately, and Sansui responded with a gentle smile, reassuring her and even joking that if he weren't a sage, that kind of attention might actually make him happy. And neither of them realized that Rain and the young lady had been watching the entire exchange from the shadows. Rain innocently chimed in, asking if Sansui would protect her too, which of course got a definite nod. But the warm moment evaporated fast when Sansui sensed a powerful aura approaching. He realized the current and former heads of the family were heading their way fast. Sure enough, the sound of horses thundering in broke through the quiet. An elite cavalry unit appeared in the distance, carrying the family's banner, signaling the highest-ranked leader arriving in a full combat formation, which was not normal. The young lady could only sigh, trying to piece together what she'd put in that letter she'd sent to set all this off. In the middle of Rain, clinging to someone for safety, a man on horseback was yelling at the top of his lungs, demanding payback for what he saw as disrespect. Calmly, the young lady asked Sansui to step in and get the situation under control before things spiraled. Brower was told to stay on full alert to protect her if things went sideways up front. Without wasting time, Sansui shot toward the lead rider. With one lightning-quick, precise move, he yanked the man off his horse. As it turned out, the one going absolutely ballistic was none other than the Sword Saint himself, arriving in a full emotional meltdown. The Sword Saint erupted, screaming at Sansui, demanding to know what he'd done to his daughter. His face was red with a rage he clearly couldn't hold back. Sansui recognized right away that this old man's power was on a completely different level. He had to stay sharp and keep moving to avoid getting crushed by the wild, reckless strikes coming at him. With the steady calm of a sage, Sansui absorbed the assault. He landed a firm counterstrike, just strong enough to stop the Sword Saint in his tracks, right when it mattered. Once the commotion settled, Sansui apologized to the other knights for the disruption. Everyone was welcome to continue on to the mansion, while Sansui kept his composure. Despite having just gone toe-to-toe with a living legend, in a separate carriage, the mood was noticeably calmer, but thick with anticipation. A young man sat inside, gripping his large sword tight, like he was forging some kind of deep connection with the blade during the ride. The voice of the Holy Sword Exax resonated in his mind, pledging loyalty and promising to always stand by its master as the most powerful weapon in existence. With fire in his chest, the young man steeled himself to fight alongside his sword, ready for whatever challenges the Academy had in store.
The Knight Squadron finally disbanded after what they were calling a pop quiz for the so-called Sword Saint. Even as they left with their heads bowed in respect, Sansui just stood there a little awkwardly, watching the crowd thin out. He couldn't shake the guilty feeling that he'd put way too many people through a whole lot of unnecessary trouble. In the quieter room that followed, the atmosphere somehow felt even heavier. The head of the Sopade family offered his praise, acknowledging that Sansui had passed an unannounced test, without any preparation whatsoever. It was a formal recognition that his role as a guardian was ironclad, even when outnumbered by a full regiment of knights. Still, Sansui felt a little uneasy. He couldn't quite see why those knights had been deployed without a real, pressing reason. The conversation shifted when the family head reached into his coat and pulled out a letter. And just like that, the entire mood in the room moved in a direction nobody saw coming. What was inside that letter absolutely blew the room apart. It stated, plain as day, that the marriage between Sansui and Brower was nothing more than a formality, and it even laid out plans about who would carry on the family line going forward. The reaction was instant and uncontrollable. Jaws dropped, faces went red, and the awkwardness that filled the room was almost unbearable for everyone present. Desperate to steer things away from that cringe-worthy topic, the conversation pivoted to Saiga. The man engaged to the Baterable family's daughter. Serious concerns were raised about his abilities. Apparently, the guy could command multiple forms of high-level magic, and that kind of raw potential was starting to look like a genuine threat to the current balance of power. That said, there was real doubt about whether Saiga could ever actually go toe-to-toe with Sansui. The title Baby-Faced Sword Saint wasn't just a fun nickname, it was recognition of a power widely considered the greatest among all sword users, and by association, it raised the standing of every family he served. With his usual humility, Sansui shrugged it off and admitted he still felt like a complete amateur compared to his master, Suiboku. That was a tough pill for everyone else to swallow. Trying to picture someone who made Sansui, a man widely regarded as unbeatable, look like a beginner was almost too much for the mind to process. Sansui described his master as someone whose power seemed to have been personally certified by the divine. When someone asked whether Saiga might be able to pick up the same advanced techniques, Sansui shut that idea down flat. There was simply no way that was happening anytime soon. He explained that even the most basic techniques he'd learned required 500 years to truly master, not the kind of thing anyone could just copy after watching it once or twice. But right in the middle of that conversation, Sansui suddenly tensed. He felt a presence. Something out there was powerful, and it definitely wasn't human. That instinct proved right when an elaborate horse-drawn carriage rolled up to the front of the estate. The tension in the room jumped right back up as everyone exchanged glances and decided together to head outside and greet whoever was arriving with that kind of overwhelming aura. A visitor who clearly came with a very specific purpose in mind. The figure that stepped out immediately turned the atmosphere electric. With a confidence that bordered on arrogance, this person made it clear they weren't there for anything small. Their whole presence suggested that whatever had brought them here was something far bigger than a casual visit. Standing there with unmistakable pride, Saiga held an extraordinary weapon. He had just been officially recognized as the rightful owner of a sacred blade, one of 8 legendary divine relics. And the look on everyone's face when they realized what they were seeing said everything. A blinding flash of light burst from the sword, forcing everyone to shield their eyes and look away. Something was happening that went completely beyond human understanding, right there in front of them, and it marked the awakening of the sword's true power. Then, shockingly, the sword transformed into a small girl who introduced herself as Ekasax. She announced herself without a shred of modesty as the most powerful sword ever created by God. The moment she said it, Sansui felt a wave of recognition, a reminder of the deity who had sent him to this world in the first place. Armed with her new weapon, Saiga wasted no time throwing down a challenge to Sansui. A month of intense training, he figured, was more than enough payback for the humiliation he'd suffered last time. But for both Sansui and Brower, a whole month as preparation for a rematch sounded almost laughably short. The story flashes back to the Batrable estate, right after that first encounter. Saiga was devastated. He hadn't even managed to leave a single scratch on Sansui. Brower's father saw the despair written all over the young man's face, and decided it was time to hand him something he'd been holding on to, a secret. The father could see that Saiga's rare talent was going to waste if he kept spiraling in frustration. He opened a small box and revealed an ancient map inside, a map that represented something Saiga had been chasing his whole life, the chance to reach a level of power that felt completely out of reach. The map pointed to the hidden location of Ekasax, the most powerful sacred sword ever documented in history. A legend now suddenly within arm's reach, offering a shortcut to a kind of strength most people couldn't even imagine. The history of that sword was staggering. It was said to have existed long before any kingdom was ever founded, and it had once been wielded by a swordsman who single-handedly brought an entire nation to its knees. With that kind of fire burning in his chest, Saiga became absolutely certain holding that blade was the only way he'd ever surpass the Sword Saint. The long search eventually brought them to the mouth of a cave, dark, foreboding, and draped in a silence that felt almost alive. There it was, half hidden behind thick forest, radiating an aura of darkness that seemed to warn anyone approaching. Turn back now. They stepped inside, footsteps swallowed by the quiet of the cave, until their eyes landed on a sword standing upright on a pile of stones. This was it, the legendary sacred blade. But the moment they arrived, a voice echoed through the darkness. A consciousness was awakening from within the sword, already fully aware that yet another soul had come looking for its power. Saiga laid it all out without hesitation. There was someone he absolutely had to defeat, no matter what it took. The sword responded with what could only be described as a dismissive sigh, as if it had heard that speech 1,000 times before and found it nothing compared to the warrior who had sealed it away here. Not about to be talked down to, Saiga pushed back. He wasn't just anyone. He carried the blessing of a god. That claim finally sparked something in the sword's interest, curious enough to test the resolve of the young man standing before it. A massive surge of energy erupted as the seal finally broke. Overflowing with joy, Saiga grabbed hold of the legendary weapon. But this small victory was just the opening act. The real test was waiting for him out in the open world. Back in front of the grand estate, the air went still the moment Saiga stepped into position. He stood across from Sansui, and the crowd around them watched in barely contained anticipation, all of them wondering the same thing. What was about to happen? The fight kicked off immediately. Saiga called on the full power of his sacred blade, Ekasax, right from the start. He was visibly confused that Sansui hadn't even drawn his sword yet, but that didn't slow him down. He was going all in from the very first second. An extraordinary transformation began to sweep over Saiga's body. His magic surged and roared, amplified to an almost frightening degree by Ekasax's unique ability to multiply its user's energy output. Encased in armor of pure light and driven by an intensity that could burn through steel, Saiga felt like he had finally reached the top of his power. And it wasn't just raw strength. His ability to see moments into the future sharpened dramatically. Saiga could now predict movements several seconds before they happened. With that advantage, he felt completely untouchable. He locked his gaze onto his target and launched his finishing strike. A devastating storm of fire crashed forward. But here's the thing about seeing the future. It doesn't free you from it. Being able to predict what was coming only meant Saiga was forced to react to it in real time, with no room to rethink, no room to change course. All that speed, all that firepower, and it didn't matter. With one impossibly precise, almost casual shift of his foot, Sansui redirected Saiga's entire momentum. In the span of a single breath, Saiga's own devastating force was turned against him and sent him crashing hard into the ground. The grip gave way. The sacred sword that Saiga had been so proud of just moments ago was now in someone else's hands. Sansui stood calmly, holding it, having demonstrated complete dominance without ever needing to break a sweat.
Saiga's defeat was total, but the real reason he lost wasn't simply a matter of power levels. It was a lack of proper training, compounded by the brutal fact that he had walked straight into the worst possible matchup for his entire fighting style. The whole thing was over almost before it started. Saiga lay there, unable to move, the full weight of it sinking in. Every single move he had made, and every calculated step, had been read completely from the very beginning. It all went down exactly as Sansui had predicted from the moment the fight started. The crowd stood in stunned silence. Nobody could wrap their head around how someone as formidable as Saiga had been put down that fast. Meanwhile, the spirit inside the sacred sword appeared genuinely shaken, even tearful, as if it had just witnessed something that went far beyond what it expected. The secret behind Sansui's technique started to come to light. That light-footed movement of his didn't just affect his own body, it extended to anything he touched. The moment he made contact with Saiga, he had shifted the weight and balance of his opponent, turning that overwhelming attack into a force that knocked Saiga straight off his own feet. Disbelief rippled through the entire crowd, including the head of the family, who couldn't fathom how raw power on that scale could be neutralized with a single touch. And while Saiga was still trying to make sense of what had happened, the spirit of the sword Ekisax was completely fixated on Sansui, as if she recognized the fingerprints of a technique she had seen somewhere before. With a trembling voice, the sword's spirit finally placed it. That flawless movement, that perfect, errorless execution could only belong to one kind of person, a student of Suiboku. Ekisax broke down in tears, the memory flooding back of the day her master had left her behind to chase a path towards something greater, alone. But Sansui's face showed nothing but confusion at the mention of that name, leaving behind a question mark about a past that had never been shared with him. The conversation shifted to the previous owner of the sword, a figure said to have lived long before this kingdom was ever established. Buried inside that history was a deep mystery about the timeline and about where a man like Suiboku actually fit into it. Doubt began to creep in. Given how ancient this kingdom's history already was, the idea that someone from that era could still be alive today seemed flat out impossible. And yet, what they had just watched with their own eyes was living proof of a power that didn't play by the rules of ordinary human existence. The possibility that Sansui's master was somehow a descendant of the sword's original owner sounded completely absurd, especially given that Suiboku was known to be a solitary hermit. But the truth slowly surfacing was shaking something loose, exposing fragments of a history that didn't quite line up with what everyone thought they knew about the present. In the darkness of a cave, a quiet apology was spoken to someone named Sakuzu. The figure standing with their back to the light gripped a sword tightly, carrying a weight of emotion too heavy to put into words in a place that heavy with silence. The driving desire to become the strongest, without depending on anyone or anything else, was the reason behind it all. The sword was left behind, standing still in the stone, as footsteps slowly walked away from a past that had been decided. There was a moment of hesitation, but the resolve held, and he kept going. Sobs broke through as the plea to not leave went completely unanswered. The grief was raw and real, leaving a wound that those who witnessed it could feel in their chests. The others around them could only fall silent, trying to make sense of a pain that had just made the room completely different. The explanation that a hermit could live for thousands of years left everyone speechless. That single piece of information seemed to shatter whatever logical framework they'd been relying on, and the looks on their faces made it clear that none of them knew how to process the existence of someone who had simply outlived every human boundary. With urgency rising in her voice, the girl demanded answers from the young man identified as Suiboku Suiboku's student. Sansui, steady as ever, began to acknowledge that the master they were describing was almost certainly the same person, even though he himself had never heard of them before this moment. When asked how old he actually was, Sansui genuinely struggled to give a straight answer. He didn't have a clear memory of exactly how long he'd been alive, but somewhere in the blur, a flash of the past came back to him, a younger version of himself swinging a wooden sword alone in the middle of a forest. When he admitted he had been training under his master's guidance for roughly 500 years, the room went completely still. A number that impossible just hanging in the air made every single person freeze. No one could find words for what it meant to spend that much time doing nothing but training. Back inside the quiet mansion, a feeling of betrayal started to surface. Keeping something that significant a secret felt like a serious breach of trust, even as a few voices in the room tried to defend him by pointing out that there was never any bad intention behind his silence. The Baron stepped in with measured calm. As hard as it was to process logically, 5 years of knowing this person had earned him at least the benefit of the doubt. But from here on out, there could be no more hiding anything. Sansui was going to have to lay everything out on the table, no exceptions. And so the truth began to pour out. Starting from the very beginning, being born in a completely different world, his accidental death caused by a mistake made by the deity who created Ekasax, how he ended up as Suiboku's student by that same god's instruction, and how he spent 5 centuries doing nothing but sharpening his swordsmanship. That long journey eventually brought him to Rain, a chance encounter in the middle of a forest. The Baron chose to believe him, not just because of the words, but because of the strength and the character Sansui had shown over the years of them knowing each other. It was a moment of relief, finally letting the truth breathe after keeping it buried for so long. The title, Babyface Sword Saint, suddenly made a whole lot more sense, but one question still lingered. Was it really true that after all that time, he had only mastered 4 techniques? Sansui swore on it. That was the full truth, and there was nothing else he was holding back. Fresh disbelief hit the room. 500 years and only 4 techniques to show for it? For anyone who hadn't lived inside the logic of ancient hermit training, this was truly impossible to rationalize. Right in the middle of all that confusion, Rain suddenly decided there was something very personal she needed to ask her father. Her innocent question about why he had chosen her name ended up landing in a very unexpected place. Sansui admitted completely honestly that the name Rain had simply popped into his head in the moment. No deep meaning, no long thought behind it. It just came to him. That honest answer hurt. Rain shouted that she hated him and bolted out of the room. The Baterable Mansion's evening had become the quiet witness to this little family drama, while the deeper conversation about who Sansui really was continued inside without missing a beat. For a hermit of Sansui's caliber, 500 years was apparently still considered very young. That shift in perspective hit the room hard, a reminder of just how enormous the gap was between regular people and someone like Sansui. Suddenly, all that extraordinary strength had a perfectly logical explanation behind it. The old legends about hermits who could lift mountains and bend the weather to their will, not fairy tales. Suiboku had actually done those things. Hearing that out loud made everyone's skin crawl a little, because it meant the person standing in front of them was the student of someone who had walked straight out of legend and into real life. Saiga felt the full weight of embarrassment crash down on him. He'd been out here bragging about 1 month of training in front of someone who had spent 5 centuries at it. On the other side of the conversation, a bigger question had started forming. Why would a hermit of that magnitude choose to become a guardian for someone like Dewey? A heavy quiet settled over the room when the challenge to face the hermit's student again was thrown out there. Saiga could only sit in silence, a cold sweat breaking across his skin, finally grasping just how different a level he'd been playing on compared to the one Sansui actually occupied. Then the outburst came. Tsuga couldn't hold it in anymore. She insisted, firmly and without apology, that this had to stop. Grabbing Saiga's hand tightly, she begged him, genuinely begged, to stop going after Master Sansui. The fear of losing him and the pain of watching someone she cared about keep getting hurt had finally pushed her past any concern for formality. The memory of those crushing defeats played through her mind like a loop, and the gap between their levels of ability was painfully clear. Tsuga asked out loud what everyone else had been quietly thinking for a while now. Wasn't losing 3 times already enough to make the point? It was the most honest question anyone in that room had been brave enough to say. In a steadier, but no less firm voice, Tsuga laid out the hard reality. Defeating the student of someone like Suiboku meant mastering rare and advanced forms of magic and dedicating decades of your life to training. She urged Saiga Saiga practically demanded that he make a promise to stop going after Sansui. Looking into Tsuga's eyes and seeing how serious she was, Saiga finally gave in and agreed to let it go. That night, Saiga sat alone on the dormitory steps, staring down at the hands resting in his lap, hands that still felt weak. The mention of hundreds of years of training kept playing on repeat in his head. 500 years. The distance between them wasn't just big. It was the kind of gap that no amount of pure motivation could ever close on its own. A few days had passed since the duel. In one of the quieter corners of the campus, the mood felt relaxed, but a little awkward. Sansui was now on the receiving end of a very different kind of challenge, a very serious lecture from Little Rain, while his employer sat off to the side, watching calmly over a cup of tea. Rain was upset, but not about the fact that they didn't share blood. She had known that for a long time. What had her fuming was that her name had been handed to her on a whim, without a single second of thought. To her, a name wasn't just a label, it was an identity. It was sacred. You don't just pick one in the moment, like it's nothing. Sansui could only bow his head and apologize for what he now recognized as a pretty thoughtless moment from the past. Rain made it clear that she actually loved her name. She just couldn't stand the way it had been decided. Right in the middle of that father-daughter back and forth, a knock at the door broke the tension. Their longtime rival, Dewey, had come to visit. But this visit felt completely different from any before it. Head bowed low, Dewey openly admitted his defeat. That was a surprise to just about everyone in the room, given how stubbornly he'd refused to accept reality through 3 straight losses. It seemed like he had finally reached the moment where his ego simply couldn't argue with the facts anymore. Dewey acknowledged that his stubbornness had done nothing but make things harder for the people around him. He was starting to understand that knowing when to walk away and owning your limits is its own kind of growth. When someone asked him what had been driving all those reckless challenges, he answered plainly. He just refused to believe he could lose. Looking back on it, even he had to admit it was a little ridiculous. But that was behind him now. Dewey had made a decision. His strength was going to be used to protect others, not feed his own pride. Even if his most powerful strike, had it connected, could have erased Sansui without a trace, he chose to bury that dark ambition for good. The conversation drifted toward a deeper topic, the figure of Suiboku himself. Tsuga shared her complicated feelings about seeing the student of a hermit. That legendary choose to serve someone ordinary, genuine curiosity, started bubbling up about what kind of person the legendary master really was, since even Sansui struggled to picture what his teacher might have been like in his younger years. Tsuga hesitated a little, aware that Sansui was right there in the room, but went ahead and shared her honest perspective. To her, Suiboku was the definition of pride and ambition. He wasn't the type to bow to anyone, not to any person, not under any sky. His personality, she explained, was explosive in every sense of the word. More kingdoms than anyone could count had been reduced to ash simply because someone managed to tick him off. Hearing all of this, Sansui broke out in a cold sweat, realizing just how terrifying his master's reputation actually was. Out in the wider world, especially compared to the version of him Sansui saw every day. Suiboku's anger, they said, had a way of bleeding into nature itself, triggering volcanic eruptions, turning dense forests into scorched wasteland, sometimes just as a side effect of his own training. He was less of a person and more like a walking natural disaster. Sansui could only manage a strained smile and confirm that, yeah, his teacher had a habit of doing completely unhinged things on a regular basis. But for Rain, the whole story just made everything cooler. Having a dad who was literally the student of someone like that was something to brag about. While Rain basked in the excitement, Sansui quietly gazed toward the forest and wondered how his teacher was doing out there. Far away in a quiet and forgotten place, there was an unmarked pile of stones sitting in the middle of overgrown brush, something that could easily pass for a forgotten grave. 2 mysterious cloaked figures were doing something there, until a man's voice appeared behind them, out of nowhere and interrupted. He warned them in a casual tone that grave robbing wasn't exactly an admirable pursuit. Even as both strangers immediately reached for their weapons and tensed up, the man stayed perfectly calm and asked them to lower their blades, because he already knew they were something more than ordinary hired swords. Turns out, the 2 of them had come to find out who was buried there. The man explained that 5 years ago, A woman carrying a baby with silver hair had been attacked by wolves at this very spot. By the time he found her, it was too late to save her, so he had buried her there himself. As for the silver-haired baby, the man offered a reassuring answer. The child was being looked after by his student and was most likely growing up safe in the world of humans, far away from the dangers of this forest. Once the two cloaked visitors had gone, the man exhaled, relieved they'd been willing to talk things out without anyone having to get hurt. Tilting his face toward the clear sky above, he muttered quietly to himself, wondering how his student was holding up out there, raising that child in the world beyond the trees. Inside the headmaster's office, an important report was delivered with a heavy tone. The search for this mysterious individual had completely dead-ended. Not a single trace, not the faintest clue about who they actually were. The headmaster responded with quiet composure, well aware of how quickly a rumor could take on a life of its own. To him, a loose piece of gossip was like moths in a jar. Once the lid comes off, they scatter in every direction, faster than anyone can follow. The focus shifted to Shirokuro Sansui. The idea that he was a swordsman who had been alive for over 500 years was admittedly a lot to swallow, but given the depth of what he was capable of, it was starting to make an unsettling kind of sense. Even granting that Master Saiga was extraordinarily skilled, he still fell short of matching Sansui. A long gaze stretched past the window as the headmaster weighed the situation carefully. Saiga may well have surpassed the royal family's personal guards in raw ability, but there was still room for that young man to grow. The royal family simply could not afford to fall behind and needed to find a protector who could genuinely stand on equal footing. The ambition that followed was clear. Out there somewhere, there had to be someone with the kind of extraordinary power and capability to stand as a true rival to the man they called the Lightning Blade, Sansui himself. Meanwhile, back at the Dewey estate, things felt a little lighter, but the topic du jour was still hard to get around. The fact that Sansui had apparently been alive for 5 whole centuries was just not something people could absorb easily. The young lady offered an apology for having kept that secret for as long as she had, and honestly, the whole arranged marriage situation with Brower now had to be reconsidered. Because how exactly do you go ahead with marrying someone who is, technically speaking, a 500-year-old in a young man's body? But here's the thing that made it even more complicated. Sansui was going to look exactly the same decades from now as he did today. That gap between age and appearance made an already tricky conversation about marriage even harder to resolve, and they ultimately agreed to put it on hold for the time being. Frustration was beginning to build in the young lady's mind. She made a firm decision. She was going to find her own companion for the Sopeid family, someone powerful with a clear and honorable background, who carried himself well and who wouldn't cause her any embarrassment along the way. Sansui gave a tight smile at the ambition, privately doubting any man was going to make it past her father and brother, who were notoriously protective, and get anywhere near her. Right in the middle of that thought, a messenger from the Caputo family arrived with an urgent message. There was something that needed to be delivered directly, and immediately into the hands of Lady Dewey Sopeid herself. The letter turned out to be from Palette Caputo. Written in a rush, it had the young lady leaning in with curiosity the moment she began to open it. Inside, Palette apologized for not being able to come in person. She wrote about the arrival of a foreign swordsman, exceptionally gifted, who was now demanding to be brought before the strongest warrior the kingdom had to offer. Palette was absolutely certain that Sansui was the only person capable of stopping him. That's why she was reaching out, urging them all to come to the Caputo territory right away and to bring the Sword Saint with them. As one of the 4 great noble families, a request from the Caputo house was never something to take lightly. Even with the urgency of the situation hanging in the air, the young lady found herself leaning into a different angle entirely, asking whether this foreign swordsman happened to be handsome and well-built. The messenger's answer, young, powerful, and honorable, instantly lit the young lady up. Strong and good-looking? That sounded like a pretty perfect combination to her. Without wasting another second, she ordered the whole group to get ready and head to the Caputo estate immediately. Arriving in Caputo territory, they were greeted by the familiar noise of a busy town. A guard quickly stepped up and directed the group toward Lady Palette, who was already waiting for them. On the way, some conversation naturally drifted to why the young lady still didn't have a fiancé. The answer, as it turned out, came down to her father and brother, whose overprotectiveness had kept everyone every potential suitor at a comfortable distance, which was a bit ironic since the young lady herself had never really shown much interest in anyone before. Rain was genuinely curious whether this foreign swordsman might end up liking their lady. Brower and Sansui could only respond with quiet uncertainty, both of them sensing that matters of the heart and matters of strength weren't exactly going to line up in a nice, neat way. Their steps slowed as they came across a large crowd gathered around something in the middle of the street. A fight was happening between a local noble and the foreign swordsman, and every person standing there was burning with the same question: just how strong was this man who had come from so far away? The foreign man stood with a confidence that pulled every eye in the crowd toward him like gravity. He told the soldiers in front of him in a flat, almost bored tone that fighters at their level were never going to land a hit on him. Off to the side, Sir Nuri groaned in frustration as he surveyed his forces, completely laid out flat on the ground, while the foreigner stood there without a single mark on him. The sight had the young lady visibly flustered, her admiration barely concealed. Sansui, meanwhile, felt mildly irritated, like the whole universe had just arranged itself to make this guy look incredible. The man's presence absolutely owned the space. Then the young lady noticed Sansui's group and called out to them with unmistakable energy. In the middle of the rising tension, Palette Caputo appeared and apologized for the short notice. She quickly confirmed with the group whether what was happening right in front of them was connected to the letter she had sent earlier. The root of it all came out. The foreign man, named Toon, had gotten into a serious dispute with Sir Nuri, a nobleman from the Domino Empire. Both of them were standing firm on being in the right and refusing to settle things in court. The Domino Empire itself, a neighboring country to the Kingdom of Arcana, had recently been rocked by a major revolution. The upheaval there had sent the imperial family into custody, while the remaining nobles scattered and fled for refuge wherever they could find it, including Arcana. Since none of them were criminals, they were welcomed. But now conflicts were breaking out all over the place for reasons that weren't immediately clear. Sir Nuri had even brought his own private soldiers to take on Toon, only to end up humiliated. The young lady's take? Send the disgraced nobleman back to Domino and be done with it. But Palette pushed back on that. They couldn't afford to rush into anything. Both sides deserved to be heard before anyone could determine what was actually true. Toon, for his part, made it plain that he wasn't going anywhere willingly. If they wanted him to talk, they were going to have to earn the right by beating him in a fight. Toon then turned his attention to Sansui, addressing him by the title the world had given him, the baby-faced Sword Saint, or whatever people were calling him these days. The young lady immediately pushed Sansui forward, but with one condition: he couldn't let Toon get seriously hurt. Palette echoed the same request, hoping Sansui would go easy on him. Sansui agreed without much fuss and reached for his wooden sword, while little Rain cheered her dad on with everything she had. On the other side, Sir Nuri scoffed at Sansui. To him, this unassuming-looking young man had no shot against someone who had already taken out his best soldiers. He didn't believe for 1 second that holding back was going to be realistic in a fight like this, but Nuri was already running his own calculations in the background. Either outcome, he figured, worked out in his favor. If Sansui got taken down, Toon would face consequences for harming someone important. And if Sansui turned out to be extraordinarily powerful and Toon ended up losing, well, that problem disappeared permanently. A neat little win-win from where he was standing. Before things got started, Toon introduced himself with the kind of easy energy that suggested he genuinely enjoyed this, then asked for his opponent's name. Sansui answered politely, Shirokuro Sansui. Around them, the crowd was beginning to pick up on something, an aura rolling off Toon that was hard to ignore. The young lady kept remarking on how incredible Toon was. Strength, presence, the whole package. Rain, completely undeterred by any of it, just kept yelling encouragement at her dad, fully convinced Sansui was going to win this. The duel began. Toon rushed in immediately with a technique he called the Loyal Shadow Dance. His movements were blindingly quick and deliberately disorienting, creating the illusion of being everywhere at once, making it nearly impossible for anyone to pinpoint where he actually was. The crowd gasped as Toon appeared to split into two versions of himself. Strike after strike came flying in at incredible speed, and yet, with a calmness that seemed almost supernatural, Sansui blocked every single one without moving an inch from where he stood. Toon kept shifting, kept hunting for an opening from every angle he could find. He escalated his technique into something called the Trapping Shadow Dance. His after images, now so convincing and aggressive, they looked genuinely dangerous. Steel rang out again and again as the fight raged. Toon launched himself from above, and Sansui caught it cleanly, then pushed pushed Toon back with enough force to make him take notice. Sansui's steady, unshakable strength was beginning to register. This wasn't just anyone he was up against. Palette and the young lady realized Toon was using some kind of rare magic capable of generating perfect copies of himself. Even so, they couldn't help being amazed at how well Sansui was keeping pace with something that advanced. While staying sharp and composed, Sansui began mapping the weaknesses in his opponent's approach. He noticed that Toon's strategy was built on volume, overwhelming with numbers. But that precise, focused control only worked when he was operating with a single shadow. As a fighter, Sansui placed Toon slightly above Brower when raw physical strength was factored in. A genuinely skilled swordsman, Toon felt something shift inside him. The long journey away from his homeland hadn't been for nothing. He hadn't expected to find someone like Sansui here. Sensing he'd finally found a worthy opponent, Toon decided it was time to pull out the ability he'd never shown anyone before. With a war cry, Toon released his ultimate technique. This time, the number of shadow copies that appeared was on a completely different scale than anything before, surrounding Sansui from all directions. The crowd erupted in shock, unable to believe what they were seeing. Toon unleashed his signature move, the True Shadow Dance. This series of attacks was designed specifically to exploit reaction time, using waves of duplicates coming from every direction simultaneously. For any normal fighter, that kind of pressure from all sides would be the end of the fight, right then and there. But a true master's instinct is to push forward, not retreat. Toon watched as his opponent broke through the trap, but he wasn't done yet. With full confidence, he was already setting up his finishing blow. Just as Toon prepared to bring his blade down, something strange stopped him cold. The wooden sword his opponent had been holding was gone. Confused, he looked up and realized it had been thrown into the air. Before he could react, the wooden sword dropped perfectly back into Sansui's waiting hand. Sansui was already in a position that left Toon completely exposed. It was over in a single, impossibly precise moment. Quiet fell over the whole area as the spectators slowly realized the fight was done. Sansui said it simply with a calm smile. The duel was over. Toon took a breath and offered a genuine, gracious concession. Praise came pouring in from the witnesses, marveling at how Sansui had seemed to anticipate every move before it even began. Toon acknowledged that he had completely underestimated the Sword Saint, and that going in, he really had believed his shadow technique was unbeatable. Sansui explained that from the beginning, he had seen two possible tactics Toon might use, either a full encirclement all at once, or a staged approach designed to gradually open a gap. Meanwhile, Toon expressed genuine gratitude to Lady Palette for setting this up as a formal proceeding to resolve the conflict. Now it was Nuri's turn to make good on his word and show up to the hearing. Even though he started sweating and scrambling for excuses about pressing business, he had nowhere to run. Palette reminded him, calmly and clearly, that the deal was simple. If Town agreed, Nuri had to follow through. The stakes for Nuri climbed higher when Palette called in a curse mage from the Sabe family to ensure that honesty was enforced. The young lady, clearly delighted by the whole situation, extended an invitation to Sansui to come watch this rather unconventional proceeding play out. Elsewhere in the city, word was already spreading about the baby-faced Sword Saint's latest victory. Rain, out walking with Brower, caught pieces of conversations where curious onlookers were buzzing about the foreign swordsman who had just been beaten. Rain found herself wondering what people actually saw when they looked at the Sword Saint. Brower described him as someone who came across as surprisingly boyish and unremarkable at first glance, easy to overlook. But Rain's curiosity quickly moved on to the possibility of their lady marrying Toon. Brower noted the possibility was real, given how highly their lady had rated Town. When Rain playfully asked whether Brower herself might fall for the guy, Brower went visibly flustered, caught completely off guard by that innocent little question. Rain got a little worried that Brower might not end up marrying her dad after all. Brower sat with that for a moment, realizing that from the time she was young, she had always been so focused on serving and protecting her lady that she hadn't really developed a full understanding of what love was supposed to feel like. Still, she admitted that there had never been anyone else she had ever wanted to marry. Rain immediately lit up and told her to just go say it, to tell both her dad and her lady how she felt. Soon after, back at the Caputo estate, Rain greeted them on their return. Sansui looked absolutely drained, as if watching a curse mage conduct an interrogation had taken something out of him that was hard to explain. At the dinner table, they recounted how the curse magic worked. Anyone who lied was turned to stone. The truth that came out was that Nuri had harbored deeply dishonorable intentions toward a commoner girl, and Toon had simply been trying to stop it. The The young lady said she thoroughly enjoyed watching the terror spread across Nuri's face the moment everything came to light. Pallet apologized for resorting to such a heavy-handed method, but Toon actually pushed back, admitting he shared some of the blame for being stubborn and refusing to just explain the situation from the start. For Toon, going through the curse magic experience turned out to be unexpectedly meaningful. Watching someone who had done wrong have to stand there and confess it out loud, that was deeply satisfying in a way he hadn't expected. He told Pallet there was nothing to feel sorry about. Toon's straightforward, principled behavior left an impression on the women in the room, but all of his attention had now shifted entirely to Sansui. He admitted that witnessing that level of swordsmanship up close had completely captivated him. Then, without warning, Toon stood up from his seat and bowed deeply before Sansui. With all the sincerity he had, he made his request to be accepted as the Sword Saint's student. Sansui was genuinely thrown off. The man had just been putting up a real fight moments ago, and now he was bowing that low, saying Sansui hadn't even shown that much. The young man introduced himself properly as Tun Majan and practically begged Sansui to take him under his wing. Faced with that kind of genuine enthusiasm, an invitation was extended. Come stay with them for a while. In the middle of that conversation, a name came up that changed everything. When asked if the name Sunai meant anything to him, Toon confirmed immediately. That was his younger sister. The room erupted. Everyone's reaction hit at exactly the same moment as they pieced together a connection none of them had seen coming. The surprises kept coming. Toon looked genuinely shocked to learn that his sister was already engaged. He made it very clear he wasn't okay with that and intended to get to the bottom of it himself. Meanwhile, there was a lingering sense of guilt on the royal side about having involved a prince from a foreign kingdom in the whole curse. Magic proceeding, making a formal apology, feel entirely necessary. There was a brief holdup, but ultimately, the decision was made. Toon was welcome to come along with them. The hosts also felt the urgency of clearing things up as quickly as possible, and for the sake of everyone involved, that became the priority. The revelation that Toon was a prince with a clear and distinguished lineage left everyone a little stunned. At the same time, there was a complicated mix of feelings about how close they had all come to being connected to the royal family through that relationship. Sansui could only manage an awkward smile as he watched the situation get more tangled by the minute, and so they set off in a horse-drawn carriage. Destination, the Batrable estate, where Toon's sister was waiting. The departure carried with it a quiet but shared hope that the meeting ahead would clear up the misunderstandings before anything else got worse. Inside the moving carriage, Toon offered his apologies for all the complications his sister had stirred up in the Kingdom of Arcana. The response he got flipped things around. It was actually her fiancé who had caused far more headaches. The conversation then drifted toward Toon's admiration for Sansui, whom he had come to see as a true dedicated practitioner of the sword's art. Toon said he felt genuinely honored just to have the chance to learn from someone who had spent 500 years honing their craft. His ongoing bowing and deep humility made it increasingly awkward for Sansui to keep saying no. With a little nudging from the group, Sansui slowly started to come around. Even so, Sansui explained that he would need his master's permission first. He also shared something he hadn't brought up before, that he had actually been instructed not to return to the forest where his master lived until Rain reached adulthood. That restriction was the main obstacle standing between Toon and getting the training he wanted. Given that roadblock, it was decided they would go meet the master in person. The plan was to stop by Hapine's first and borrow the sacred sword Ekasax as a means of travel. In the middle of making those arrangements, Brower got gently teased about how close she had come to marrying someone now being called a living fossil. Then, out of nowhere, Brower made a sudden and heartfelt request. Could the previously paused discussion about her marriage to Sansui be reopened for consideration? That caught Sansui completely off guard and left him utterly speechless, having not expected that topic to resurface like this. The suggestion that followed was to have that conversation properly before they went to meet the master. Even though it was clear nerves were involved, an agreement was reached to sit down and talk through the details after returning to the mansion, while Sansui just quietly went along with wherever things were headed. Toon reflected that this sword saint was turning out to have a lot more depth than he ever would have guessed. Not long after, the carriage rolled to a stop in front of the imposing grounds of Batrable Mansion, the place where the heart of everything was about to be confronted. In the grand meeting hall, Toon once again expressed his embarrassment over the trouble his sister had brought to so many people. He was genuinely grateful for the gracious way they had continued to treat them as respected nobility, even with the strict expectations that came with maintaining a royal bloodline. line. With full composure, Toon formally apologized on behalf of his father, the king, for his sister's behavior. Even as the hosts tried to be understanding, Toon turned directly to Sunai with a firm reprimand. He was disappointed in how she had been acting on impulse, without any thought for the longer-term consequences of her choices. Toon reminded Sunai of her responsibilities as a future heir to the throne and the importance of thinking about what their parents would feel. He then turned his attention to Saiga, the fiancé, and offered an equally direct criticism for failing to look more carefully into the potential issues that could arise from this relationship. Saiga acknowledged the criticism and admitted it was completely fair. There was an awkward moment when it sank in just how close they had come to becoming family through that connection. The conversation then moved forward to Saiga's future role as the heir of the Batrable family. The plan to visit Sansui's master came back up, along with the need to borrow the sacred sword as part of getting permission, but the hosts and Brower were visibly taken aback when they realized that Sansui, someone who had trained for 500 years, still thought of himself as a complete beginner by his master's standards. The sacred sword Ekisax finally gave her agreement to join them. That opened the floodgates. Saiga, Sunai, and Brower all declared they wanted to come too. The curiosity about meeting a legendary master like Suiboku was just too strong to ignore, even though there were some concerns about whether showing up with such a large group might come across as disrespectful to the master. Sansui reassured everyone that patience was one of Suiboku's defining qualities. They agreed on departing the following day. Underneath the relief, though, Sansui felt a quiet pressure building. He had spent 5 centuries mastering the sword, and now the whole area of romance was catching up with him faster than he knew how to handle. Rain's excitement bubbled over as she imagined how happy their great master would be when he heard the marriage news. But Brower, on the other side of the room, was quietly spiraling. She was torn. Should she wait for Sansui to make the move, or should she be the one to take the leap first? The resulting awkwardness hung in the air, leaving the people around them at a complete loss for what to say. The private meeting arranged by their employer in the hallway of the mansion felt almost unbearably tense. Sansui and Brower stood face to face in silence, both wrestling with what they were thinking. Sansui knew this was the moment. Brower kept telling herself to be brave, to not let this pass by. The second Sansui started to open his mouth, Brower got there first, with a shout that made the nervousness painfully obvious. Sansui just stared at her. Somewhere inside, he quietly noted that in 500 years across another world, this was the first time he had ever felt this kind of intensity with a woman. Too far gone in embarrassment to pull together anything remotely romantic, Brower skipped straight to demanding that Sansui take responsibility for where things stood between them. The request landed with full confusion because Sansui genuinely had no idea what responsibility she was talking about. From a safe distance, Rain and their employer watched the whole thing play out with completely flat expressions, both silently agreeing this was about as far from romantic as it could possibly get. Time passed. The night turned into morning at the Dewey estate, and a new chapter was ready to begin. The next morning, Sansui calmly announced their decision to get married. The news landed like a surprise on all of his friends. Brower, still deeply embarrassed by everything that had happened the night before, made it very clear she had no interest in walking anyone through what had gone on, and swiftly changed the subject. With blessings and full support given, the group got ready to head out. Their destination was Sir Suiboku, who was somewhere at the edge of the Arcana Kingdom's forest. A quick farewell, and then the journey began. Moving through the dense forest, congratulations kept finding their way to Brower, who accepted them with soft, bashful deflections. As they went deeper in, people started wondering out loud how much farther they actually had to go. All they knew was keep walking into the forest to find the great master. Ekisax began to wonder aloud whether Suiboku would even want to see her after everything, after being left behind for so long. Sansui offered a different way of seeing it. He didn't believe Suiboku had abandoned her. More likely, his master had simply reached a point where he no longer needed the power of a weapon to define his strength. Then, without warning, the person they had been looking for stepped out from behind a tree. Suiboku looked strikingly young, which surprised everyone. He explained that the reason he had kept his distance all this time was that he hadn't wanted to be seen in a state he wasn't proud of, but he had finally crossed the threshold into what he would call a true hermit. The reunion carried real emotion as Suiboku welcomed his old sword back. He also took the time to give Sansui genuine praise for the way he had raised Rain into such a remarkable young person, and for finding a partner worth holding onto. Then Suiboku gave a small demonstration of his ability in a movement too fast for the the eye to track, he was suddenly in a completely different position without making contact with a single person in the group. The move was called the flash step, and both Brower and the others were left completely breathless by what they had just witnessed. After that brief showing, Suiboku led them to a simple pile of stones. It was the resting place of the woman who had given everything to protect Rain. With quiet reverence, Rain knelt down and offered her prayers. From there, the conversation turned to the philosophy of strength. Suiboku reflected that what it means to be the strongest looks different to everyone. For him, Sansui, as he was now, represented the truest form of what a swordsman's ideals should look like. Someone reliable, someone worth following. He elaborated on how Sansui possessed complete control over his abilities, knowing equally well when to win and when to show mercy. That discipline in training, that clarity of vision, and that quiet presence of mind, those things, Suiboku said, were the real core of what it meant to carry a sword. He went on to speak about humility, gratitude, and the willingness to share what you know with those who are ready to receive it. Saiga, listening to every word, felt something stir deep inside, his admiration for Sansui reaching a whole new level. With real conviction, Saiga declared his desire to grow stronger under Sansui's guidance. The calm of that moment was briefly interrupted when Suiboku recalled something. A group of people who had come to that gravesite looking for a young child. The news of someone searching for a baby who had gone missing 5 years ago stirred up immediate concern. The group began to piece together possible motives behind the search, with the Domino Empire quickly coming to mind as a likely candidate. A quiet but unmistakable sense of dread began to settle over all of them, the feeling that something was out there, and it was already looking.
Inside the Caputo family's estate, the air was heavy with tension. Word had gotten around that the new Domino regime was moving troops to the eastern border, and their demands were pretty specific. They wanted Lord Nuri and the other nobles who'd taken refuge there to be handed over. But as far as the princess was concerned, all of that was just a cover story, a reason to start a war. Lord Nuri knew exactly what was going on. After years of suffering under the old regime, the Domino forces weren't just looking for justice. They were looking to invade, to strip the kingdom clean of whatever wealth and resources they could get their hands on. And the threat was very real because their new army was now holding 4 of the 8 legendary sacred treasures. One of those treasures was the Ungekyo, a relic with the extraordinary ability to duplicate any piece of equipment. Thanks to that power alone, tens of thousands of enemy soldiers were now walking around armed to the teeth with the finest combat gear ever produced. Facing a force like that head-on, the Caputo family knew they were in a situation that looked almost impossible to win. Under normal circumstances, they'd have been right, but this wasn't a normal situation, and everyone in that room knew it. There were fighters out there operating on a completely different level than regular humans. Names like Sir Saiga and the Lightning Blade himself, Sansui, came to mind almost immediately. Forces that didn't exactly follow the rules of what was supposed to be possible. The princess thought back to the last time she'd seen Sansui in action. He'd taken down the entire Royal Guard's elite unit by himself. Not a single wound on him, not a single kill on his hands either. He'd dismantled them completely, and in doing so, had pretty much shattered what was left of the royal family's pride. But here's the thing, the Caputos weren't coming to the table empty-handed. If the Sopid family had Sansui, the Caputos had something just as terrifying. The most powerful sorcerer who had ever lived. We're talking about someone whose magical essence was thousands of times greater than any elite mage out there. There were people who genuinely believed this person could level an entire nation on their own. That was their ace in the hole, a young man named Kyoyub Shuzu, known to most people as the Scarred Fool. But while everyone else in the room was anxious, Shuzu himself looked thrilled. In his mind, this was the moment he'd been waiting for, his chance to finally show the world what he was really capable of. The head of the Caputo family gave him a heavy order to eliminate the enemy forces heading their way. The soldiers nearby were nervous, worried that if Shuzu lost even a bit of control, the city itself might catch the blast. But Shuzu just smiled and told them not to worry. He was going to work really, really hard. For the Caputo family's sake, he was willing to do anything. The trust the head of the family had placed in him, that alone was enough fuel to keep him going as he watched the enemy army begin its slow march toward the defensive walls. With one firm command to wipe out the invaders, Shuzu got ready to cut loose. He answered with a shout full of energy, ready to prove exactly why they called him the ace. He started gathering his magical energy, pulling it together into a massive fireball that blazed and roared above his head. The sheer amount of power collecting there was almost hard to look at. It was clear that whatever was about to happen wasn't going to be small. On the other side of the field, the advancing troops had stopped. Something was wrong strong, they could feel it. And when they looked up and saw that enormous ball of fire hurtling toward them, the only thing they could do was stare in wide-eyed terror. The explosion that followed was unavoidable. Shuzu's strike tore through everything in front of it, leaving nothing but devastation in its wake. When the dust and smoke finally thinned out, what was left was a massive crater carved deep into the earth. The enemy forces that had been marching toward them just moments ago gone, every last one of them erased by a single attack. Even Shuzu was a little surprised by that. He hadn't expected one shot to do that much. Up on the fortress wall, the head of the Caputo family could only murmur in disbelief, watching the hidden power they'd been sitting on finally reveal itself. Lord Nuri felt deeply satisfied watching all of it unfold. With a sorcerer like that on their side, taking back the Domino Empire suddenly felt a lot more realistic. And right in the middle of all that excitement, important news arrived. The last surviving member of the Imperial family had finally been found. Elsewhere, Sansui was standing near the carriage when he picked up on something, a group of riders approaching from a distance. The cloud of dust they were kicking up made it pretty obvious they were in a hurry. The group turned out to be led by a young nobleman, and he looked furious. He was there looking for someone named Town, who he believed had gotten way too close to his younger sister. The anger radiating off him was almost a physical thing. One of his companions managed to calm him down enough to ask whether his sister's group had already gone into the forest. Sansui stayed composed but noticed some movement in the trees nearby. He explained that the group they were looking for was currently meeting with his master, Suiboku. And almost as if on cue, the very people they'd been waiting for stepped out from the forest. What happened next, nobody quite expected. A figure that several people recognized stepped right into view, and the young woman's face immediately shifted from confusion to recognition. Standing there were her older brother and her father. And the man who just arrived, Town, was apparently the brother of Sunny, who was treated with great respect as a sibling of the well-regarded Madame Dewey. The reunion, which should have been fairly formal, completely fell apart the moment emotions got involved. One second it was calm, and the next there was shouting. Someone was furious and zeroing in on a specific face in the crowd. Town's presence was eventually accepted, though things stayed a little awkward for a while. They got down to business pretty quickly after that. Right after the group had headed into the forest, the Caputo family had sent word that Domino forces had just launched a full invasion. The good news was that a single sorcerer had pushed them all back, but their father wasn't celebrating. As far as he was concerned, this was far from over. The analysis of the bigger power picture continued from there. Now that everyone knew the Caputo family had a sorcerer that powerful, the royal family, who were currently running low on military strength, was starting to show some concerning behavior. There was real worry that the royals might try to use that sorcerer along with Sansui as leverage against the new Domino regime to prevent a larger war from breaking out. They exhaled slowly, taking in just how often petty concerns clouded the judgment of those in power. It also came out that the royal family had been quietly holding a grudge ever since Sansui dismantled the royal guard some time ago. For those hearing that for the first time, it was a genuine shock, a reminder of just how tangled the politics had got. The decision was made. They needed to head to Caputo territory right away. The young lady agreed to table the conversation about taking on a new student and focus on what was more pressing. They also extended an invitation to Town and his companion to come along, since the situation had grown to involve interests that spanned multiple regions. With the kind of fighting spirit that was typical of Majin folk, Town's companion made it clear they weren't the type to run from a fight and would help however they could. Town's presence on the journey was genuinely welcomed, though behind that warmth, the young lady was already thinking a few moves ahead. It was pretty obvious she had other plans brewing when it came to the man from Majin. Sansui watched from a slight distance and felt a small wave of concern wash over him. He figured that if she pushed too hard without thinking about whether the other person was on board, things weren't going to end well. Then came the surprise when he tried to figure out Town's actual background. It turned out the humble, easygoing guy was a prince. Town just laughed when he felt the curiosity in the air. He said he wasn't blind to the world and honestly felt honored that someone as remarkable as the young lady was showing interest in him. Yes, he was a prince of the kingdom of Majin, but he was quick to point out that he wasn't anywhere near the line of succession. Speaking in a way that was almost disarmingly direct, Town said that if she really wanted him around, dedicating his life to this kingdom didn't actually sound like a bad idea. That landed like a bomb. Sansui and the others just stood there, blinking. Finding out they were dealing with an actual prince made the whole atmosphere suddenly feel very different from what it had been a minute ago. And so the big movement began. The heads of the four great noble families were now converging on a single point, each of them bringing along their champions and their aces. Whatever was waiting for them ahead, they were going to face it together. All of that combined strength eventually gathered in Caputo territory. The fact that figures of this importance were all meeting in one place made it clear whatever conflict was was coming wasn't a minor skirmish. It was something that would decide the future of the entire region. Out at the border of Caputo's lands, it was very quiet. Heavy, perched among the dry, rocky cliffs, a young man sat alone, turning over in his mind what he'd just done. He was known as the most powerful one there, but the weight of that power was written all over him. Pallet came to check on his uncle and asked how the young man was holding up. The uncle was honest. Shuzu wasn't entirely okay after what happened. Letting loose that much destructive force had left something of a mark on him, not on his body, but somewhere deeper. They acknowledged that as the people who'd given the order, they also had a responsibility to support the young man through what he was feeling. When Pallet approached him, Shuzu stood up and greeted him, tired but still polite. Pallet expressed genuine gratitude for everything Shuzu had done out there, but Shuzu hesitated, unsure whether what he'd done, taking lives, was really something worth being thanked for. Pallet gently reminded him that without his help, the number of casualties would have been far, far worse. Shuzu tried to make peace with the fact that there hadn't been another way. With a look full of quiet hope, he asked whether all this sacrifice, meant the war was finally going to end. That question said a lot about who he really was underneath everything. Pallet told him with full conviction that they were going to make sure the war ended. That was their responsibility, and they weren't going to let it go. Before long, the group loaded back into the carriages and moved on, leaving the silence of the battlefield behind. Inside the carriage, the young lady grumbled about town being placed in a different carriage with his sister. Meanwhile, the conversation shifted to more serious ground, trying to figure out who was actually pulling the strings. Their best guess was that it was the Domino nobles who had sought refuge in Arcana. Even without being able to confirm the enemy's identity with certainty, Sansui did his best to keep everyone's spirits up. The older brother, for his part, made it very clear that no matter who the enemy turned out to be, their first priority was protecting his little sister, even if it meant putting their own lives on the line to ensure her safety on this long journey ahead. As the head of the Sopid family and the ruler of his domain, he carried the responsibility of protecting every single person under his watch. No sacrifice was too great for him, not even his own life. He turned to Rain and told her directly she was one of his people now, and there was no reason left for her to be afraid. That declaration earned a look of quiet, genuine admiration that Rain couldn't quite hide. His sister echoed the sentiment, feeling that what they were doing was simply part of what it meant to be a member of the Sopid family. It didn't matter who was coming after Rain, disgraced nobles, the new Domino government, even the Arcana royal family itself. None of them would be allowed to touch her. To the people around them, this level of protectiveness had honestly just become part of the routine. In another carriage, things took a more serious turn. Someone raised a warning about the idea of pursuing a marriage with Lady Dewey. The risks weren't trivial. The head of the Sopid family was the kind of person who could and would act decisively if he felt threatened. A very pointed suggestion was made to reconsider the whole idea, given just how dangerous getting anywhere near her could turn out to be. In a way, the protectiveness was understandable. Having a sister as attractive and sought after as that would make any older brother defensive, and the previous head of the family had adored Dewey just as much. The warning sharpened. If that intention to marry was pushed forward, there was a very real chance of becoming the target of both of them at once. That revelation hit like a wave of cold water. The family's leader was acknowledged as someone with courage that far outpaced most of the Domino nobility. He'd even taken personal risks to protect his sister, going so far as to entrust her safety to strangers like Sansui and a woman named Brower. But not everyone found that impressive. Some felt the more pressing issue was the situation in New Domino and thought the conversation should move there instead. Keep the royal family from further inflaming an already dangerous situation, the four great families needed to present a united front. Someone raised the fair question of why they should even bother stopping the war when New Domino had been the one to start it. Retaliating against the Arcana royal family seemed reasonable on the surface, but there were much deeper considerations at play beneath that. The reality was that New Domino was land-rich but money-poor. Taking over that territory wasn't going to be easy, and there was no guarantee it would actually pay off. If the goal was simply to defeat the enemy forces, one powerful sorcerer might be enough. But occupying that much land, that would require an army plus supplies, all of it shipped directly from the Kingdom of Arcana. The burden of that alone would be enormous. Letting national interests take a back seat just to boost the royal family's ego was, frankly, a bad idea. The people who would suffer most if the war dragged on weren't the ones making the decisions. It was the soldiers on the front lines and the ordinary citizens crushed under wartime taxes. Sitting with that reality made the weight of leading a noble family feel very, very real. The Kingdom of Arcana had been standing for 300 years. For most people, that was a long, long time, though for those who'd lived far longer, it might feel a bit different. And it was through that history that the legends of power beyond the ages had been preserved, carried by the symbols of authority that still existed today. Power in this kingdom was split among four great noble families, each holding influence roughly equal to that of the royal family itself. These were warrior clans of the highest standing, who had been propping up the kingdom's military even before the nation officially came into being. Two that stood out above the rest were the Sopid family family and the Batrable family. Then there was the Caputo family, known as compassionate healers, and the Decia family, merchants whose contributions to the kingdom stretched all the way back to its founding. As recognition of their loyalty, the royal family had granted each of them territory comparable in size to the crown's own lands, along with very substantial authority over everything within those borders. That arrangement created a fairly unusual situation where the royal family in effect only controlled 1 out of 5 total territories. On paper it sounded like an ideal system, unity in the face of crisis. But in reality, the king couldn't simply move the country in whatever direction he chose because his authority wasn't absolute. Tension had been building since the Splendid family had openly pushed back against the royal family by deploying Sansui against the elite troops. At this point, the kingdom had 4 extraordinary figures considered to be ace-level forces. The problem was that the royal family had no direct control over any of them. Just as the nobles were worried about the royals acting recklessly, the royal family felt equally threatened by the growing power of the noble houses. Having an ace of their own had become something they badly wanted. That conversation, what to do about it, continued at the Caputo estate. In a meeting with the King of Arcana, discussion turned to Fushi Ukyo, the leader of the new domino government who had successfully overthrown the old empire. His power was considered comparable to any of the champions held by the great families, especially since he currently held 4 of the 8 sacred treasures. The question that kept coming up was how the royal family could obtain similar strength to maintain the balance of power. An idea came up: use the current war as an opportunity. Given that the kingdom currently had the upper hand, most of their demands would probably be accepted without much resistance. But asking the enemy leader to hand over their sacred treasures wasn't exactly a simple request and could easily backfire if not handled carefully. Launching a full invasion to extract greater concessions was one option, but it ran directly against national interests and would almost certainly be opposed by all 4 great families. There was also talk of providing food aid to the people in the region that had just been invaded, though that was an incredibly hard sell to a public still burning with anger. Right in the middle of that deadlock, a knock at the door interrupted everything. A soldier reported that a domino nobleman named Nuri was outside, insisting on an audience with the king. That caused some confusion. Why had someone like that been allowed anywhere near the gate instead of being turned away immediately? Turns out his persistence had something to do with information he was carrying, specifically about the daughter of the Sword Saint. The moment they heard that, the order was given to let him in. Nuri stepped into the room with a respectful bow, carrying news that was about to change the direction of the whole conversation. Without any preamble, the focus shifted entirely to what Nuri knew about Rain, the young girl who had been under the Sword Saint Sansui's protection. Nuri laid out the current state of things inside the Domino Empire. The rebels who called themselves the new government were running rampant, and the Emperor along with everyone connected to him had been arrested and thrown into prison. 6 years earlier, the Dark Chapter had begun when the Grand Emperor passed away, triggering a bloody succession struggle that took the lives of many members of the imperial family. In the chaos that followed, one of the Emperor's descendants vanished with their caretaker, disappearing completely to avoid being hunted down by the rebels. Search parties scoured the land for a long time, until finally a lead appeared in a forest somewhere. There, the searchers encountered a young boy wearing clothes that looked remarkably similar to what Sansui typically wore. What the child told them was startling. The caretaker had passed away, and the young imperial descendant was now under the protection of a gifted apprentice. Suspicion immediately fell on Sansui and the little girl with him, and the evidence was hard to argue with. The girl's silver hair was identical to that of the late previous emperor. The king confirmed it. She was indeed a surviving member of the Domino imperial family. That news was met with enormous excitement. People saw it as a gift from above, a chance to restore the glory of the Domino Empire. Plans were already being spoken aloud, requests for support being made. But in the middle of all that enthusiasm, someone asked the practical question: what exactly was in this for Arcana? Even with the long history between Domino and Arcana, concrete proof of the girl's identity was still going to be necessary. Nobody wanted to be used as a political symbol without something more solid to go on. The solution they landed on involved using the sacred treasure Daneslave, currently held by Ukyo, to verify the bloodline. Recognizing how important and delicate this all was, the king decided to arrange a full gathering of the 4 noble family heads as soon as possible. Everything would have to be laid out openly in front of all of them. With that, the map of power was starting to come into focus. The Splendid family had Sansui, the Batrable family relied on Saiga, the Caputo family had their so-called most powerful sorcerer, and the Decia family apparently had something formidable up their sleeve as well. Before the formal audience with the King of Arcana, the 4 noble families decided to gather privately first to reconnect and get back on the same page. During the journey to that meeting, Sansui found himself genuinely puzzled. He hadn't expected the aces from both the Caputo and Decia families to also be from Japan. He actually found himself wondering, with quiet disbelief, just how many Japanese people God was planning to send to this world. When they finally arrived at the Caputo family's estate, the welcome was formal formal but carried a genuine warmth underneath it. Guards and servants received the group with full respect, guiding them through the grand corridors of the mansion. This gathering was meant to be a moment for uniting everyone's vision in the face of the crisis threatening the kingdom. Words of gratitude were exchanged for everyone making the effort to come together in such a difficult time. But the calm atmosphere didn't last long, because a young man suddenly burst into the room carrying enough energy for about 5 people. That was Shuzu, and he launched himself into greeting mode immediately, grabbing Saiga's hand and shaking it with such force that Saiga actually looked like he was struggling. His hyperactive presence had the whole room starring, a little unsure what to make of the chaos he'd just created. Shuzu's excitement hit a whole new level when he realized the person in front of him was Sansui, the strongest sword wielder he'd wanted to meet for so long. Turns out, the guy who had just overwhelmed everyone with his personality was the Caputo family's ace. Hearing about the sorcerer who had wiped out tens of thousands of soldiers, Sansui honestly expected someone intimidating. Instead, Shuzu and everyone around him were incredibly warm and friendly. The Caputo family genuinely felt like a welcoming household right up until a heavy voice from the doorway pulled everyone's attention away. The head of the Disia family had arrived, accompanied by Yukio Shun and a woman named Pandora. Their entrance brought a noticeably different energy into the room. The welcome was polite, but Saiga felt something was off. He couldn't pick up any aura at all from Shun, which was unusual. But the woman beside him was a completely different story. She was radiating something dark and unsettling that he couldn't ignore. Things got tense fast when Ekasach suddenly appeared and recognized Pandora. And here's the thing, Pandora wasn't human. She was one of the sacred treasures, just like Ekasach's. Pandora, who turned out to be the manifestation of the cursed armor of catastrophe, burst out laughing when she found out Saiga was Ekasach's new master. She mocked Ekasach relentlessly, assuming the sacred sword had been abandoned by its previous owner, who she called a monster. But that laughter curdled into something ugly and furious the moment Pandora realized Sansui was a student of Suiboku, the very person she despised most. As far as she was concerned, a disciple of that monster was a nightmare walking, and one she wanted gone immediately. Burning with hatred, she practically urged Shun to kill all of them right there and not think twice about it. Shun shut that down immediately, telling her in no uncertain terms to be quiet. In the middle of all this, Sansui just stood there genuinely baffled, wondering what on earth his master had done 2,000 years ago to make someone this furious. Ekasach filled in some of the history. About 2,000 years back, Suiboku had used the sword to shatter Pandora's body completely, broken apart piece by piece. Before anyone could sit with the weight of that, the entire tone of the room flipped when a girl named Akril Disia came crashing through the door in a way nobody could have prepared for. She walked in without a single piece of clothing on. The room erupted. Shun moved instantly, threw his coat over her, and physically dragged her back out of the room, scolding her the entire way. It was fast, it was chaotic, and it left everyone standing there completely dumbstruck. For those who'd known Akril since she was young, honestly, that kind of thing wasn't even surprising anymore. Shuzu, watching all of this unfold, could only shake his head and feel deeply grateful that he hadn't ended up placed with a family full of people this bizarre. In a grand hall, the King of Arcana sat across from the leaders of all 4 great noble families, working through how to respond to the new domino government. The king opened by giving the Caputo family high praise for their performance in the recent battle, praise that was accepted with sincere gratitude and humility. Even though the enemy had come armed with massive combat equipment, the Caputos said that pushing them back was simply part of their duty as the protectors of the Eastern Territory. But in the middle of that formal atmosphere, someone spoke up and asked for everyone to say what they were really thinking. A surprising proposal came out: peace talks with Domino. The logic was simple: the enemy had taken heavy losses, and reaching out diplomatically wasn't going to cost the kingdom much at this point. Another noble backed it up, nodding that the Caputo territory had been secured, so the kingdom's honor was still intact. But the king had something else already in motion. He asked someone to be brought into the room. The person who walked in was Nuri, a Domino nobleman who had come seeking asylum. His presence before the council carried a piece of information that could shift everything going forward. Nuri revealed the big secret: the young girl named Rain, who had been living under the protection of the Sword Saint Sansui, was not an ordinary child. She was the rightful heir of the Domino imperial bloodline. Nuri laid out his plan. He wanted to use the Caputo family's sorcerer to crush the rebels and place Rain on the throne as the new empress, rebuilding the empire that had crumbled. That ambition sparked immediate fury. The Sopid family was deeply offended by the idea of a foreign noble trying to use a child as a political tool for his own benefit, and made the threat behind that offense defense very clear. The tension escalated as other nobles began questioning the king's judgment. Using the kingdom's resources to save another country felt to them like a betrayal of their own people. The king quickly stepped in to correct the framing before things spiraled. This wasn't just about politics. The real concern was Fushi Ukyo, the leader of the new government, who currently wielded the demonic sword Daneslave, a weapon with the terrifying ability to track anyone sharing bloodlines with someone it had ever drawn blood from. If Rain was truly descended from the emperor, she would never stop being hunted. There was no amount of protection that could fully guarantee her safety as long as that sword existed in enemy hands. Forming some kind of relationship with New Domino was the only real path to preventing a permanent crisis. After delivering that explanation, logical and hard to argue with, the king dismissed Nuri from the room, signaling that the real discussion was just getting started. The conversation moved on to the 4 sacred treasures now in enemy hands, including one capable of duplicating objects and another that controlled weather with frightening precision. But what worried the king most was the elixir, a relic that could manipulate the very timing of someone's death, and Daneslave, the blood-tracking sword. As long as those were in the wrong hands, Rain would never be truly safe, no matter how strong Sansui's protection was. Acknowledging all of that, the Sopid family reaffirmed their commitment to standing by Sansui and Rain. The king closed the meeting with the understanding that everyone needed to work together for the safety and well-being of the kingdom. Meanwhile, somewhere far more relaxed, the mood outside Shuzu's home was easy and light. Sansui and the others were just hanging around together, enjoying the downtime. The topic of Shuzu's curse came up. He explained it pretty openly. His magic had a habit of activating on its own, and when it did, whatever building he happened to be near tended to get demolished. So the curse existed to hold back that kind of uncontrolled outburst. It wasn't ideal living somewhere a bit out of the way, but at least now his house wasn't constantly in danger of being annihilated. The conversation drifted to Saiga, who was now officially Sansui's student. There was a little doubt about whether anyone could ever truly surpass their teacher, but the whole atmosphere was warm and full of laughter. Rain was very aware of the weight she was now carrying. Learning that she might be a direct descendant of the Domino Emperor had left her genuinely anxious. But in the middle of that worry, there was real comfort in the fact that the people around her were treating her exactly the same as always. Her status didn't seem to change anything for them. Sansui reflected quietly on how lucky they all were to be surrounded by people like this. Training resumed. Sansui began teaching Saiga the swordsmanship he'd learned from Master Suiboku. Saiga took the instructions seriously and with gratitude, but Panpan, watching from the side, was visibly irritated. To her, passing on techniques from that monster was deeply aggravating. She couldn't hold back and came out and said it. Why wasn't Shun bothered by Suiboku at all? In her mind, Suiboku was a being without flaw, with power that seemed to mock all of humanity, especially given his immortality. Shun's response was ice cold. If she was that annoyed, she was welcome to go die. No warmth, no softening. Instead of taking offense, one of the girls nearby looked completely delighted, like she just witnessed something incredible. Meanwhile, Sansui tried to steer things back to training. Saiga humbly admitted he didn't have natural talent, which was exactly why he hoped to learn something practical and effective. Sansui made the point that in a real fight, going after an opponent's legs was often the smartest move, even if that kind of thing wasn't exactly welcome in a formal competition. He wanted Saiga to let go of all his old assumptions about swordsmanship and start thinking more freely. A sharp remark from Dewey calling Saiga dense briefly made things uncomfortable. Sansui smoothed it over, reminding everyone that every expert started out as a beginner. Dewey kept speaking bluntly without any filter at all, and Sansui tried to be patient with that, though it still managed to get under someone's skin. With his energy restored, Saiga committed himself to giving it everything he had, even knowing the road ahead was going to be rough. Training officially kicked off, but quietly behind the calm of that training session, the complicated web of issues involving the Kingdom of Arcana and New Domino was starting to show signs of resolution. Sansui was beginning to see more clearly what moves he needed to make and who he'd actually need to confront. Then their conversation was interrupted by a stranger walking up, a formally dressed man with a very performative way of speaking. He immediately recognized Sansui as the sword saint with the boyish face. Showing up right in the middle of their downtime like this out of nowhere definitely put everyone on alert. The envoy seemed genuinely caught off guard by just how many important people were gathered in one place. Still, he felt confident. Give these young people a little flattery and some smooth words and he'd have them eating out of his hand. Without wasting time, he announced Rain's identity as a pure-blooded descendant of the Domino Emperor. Sansui, sensing something off about this whole visit, asked him directly what did he actually want. He was there to request that Rain accept the role of the next empress. Sansui pointed out that Rain already had a safe home with the Sopid family, but the man pushed back, insisting that becoming a ruler was a noble noble opportunity that should be fully embraced. He started spinning visions of a glorious future for reign on the throne. And somewhere in that speech, he took a dismissive jab at Arcana's parliamentary system, heaping praise on the absolute power of the Domino Emperor, where the ruler's word was literally law. With an arrogant laugh, he bragged that an empress's decisions were final, and anyone who dared to disobey would face serious consequences. That confidence got knocked down pretty hard. Someone reminded him that the very reason his country had fallen apart in the first place was exactly that kind of greed and disregard for the people. The envoy bristled, clearly stung by being lectured by people he'd written off as naive kids. Rain made it clear that the plan to make her empress had already been rejected by the king. Even so, the man kept trying, working the angle of what he called the best future, trying to get the young future leaders in the room to take his side. Saiga cut him off firmly. As a future successor, he said, their job right now was to respect the decisions made by the king and the current leadership. That solid, direct answer left the envoy with nothing to work with, and he left in a frustration he could barely contain. Far away in New Domino territory, the atmosphere was a lot darker. In a quiet room, a man sat alone at a chessboard, turning over a situation that had stopped going his way. The presence of a powerful sorcerer on Arcana's side was genuinely getting to him. In his mind, someone like that was messing with a game that was supposed to be fair. He got to his feet clearly angry. This kind of interference, it was crude. It had disrupted a plan he'd put a lot of thought into. Accepting this setback was unavoidable for now, but he made it very clear this wasn't over. With a hard, determined look, he swore he wasn't going to stop. He'd keep fighting until his last breath. If that's what it took, until every last drop of the Emperor's bloodline had been erased from the world. An offer of cooperation from the Desea family arrived with the kind of confidence that didn't leave much room for disagreement. They were ready to help, they said, but naturally nothing came free. With a smile that said plenty, the young woman made it clear they'd name a fair price without much back and forth, as long as the other side had the means to pay. It was an offer of military strength delivered with the kind of body language that was hard not to notice. But the easy atmosphere evaporated the moment Shun cut in with a cold, flat tone. He had no interest in wasting time on someone he considered nothing more than a frog in a well. He suggested the man be removed by whatever means seemed appropriate, because in his estimation, someone like that wasn't capable of doing anything of real consequence. That blatant dismissal sent a shock through the table. The man left with curses under his breath, furious at being treated like he was beneath contempt. But on the other side of that, Shun's cold delivery left the girl beside him thoroughly impressed. She went on and on about how cool that had been, as if throwing someone out rudely was some kind of spectacular performance. Shun felt like he just said what was obvious, nothing more. The praise kept coming anyway. From there, conversation turned to the rest of the group and the acknowledgement that they'd maybe been operating a little too rigidly. Rain sat quietly through it all, watching, noticing just how sharp Shun's attention to everything around him really was. There was a moment of doubt about whether all of this had been the right call, but the decision to clear out the leeches draining the nation had already been made. Now, everything hinged on what Ukyo Shun was going to do next. An uneasy feeling settled in because the future was getting harder and harder to predict. Discussion continued about the royal family, the likelihood that they wouldn't want to get involved if their leadership proved to be incompetent. Attention shifted to the elixir in their possession. As long as that was with them, they believed things could still stay on track, even with serious challenges ahead. Elsewhere, a prince was sitting with his own thoughts. Something about Shun had been nagging at him. As a nobleman, he was curious, genuinely curious, about who this man really was, this person who had changed so much around him. The world knew him as someone who had brought down a powerful nation and placed himself at the top of it. The question sitting heavy in the prince's mind was whether Shun truly intended to hunt Rain down just because of bloodline. What kind of person actually does something like that? What Shun actually felt privately was that he was just a swordsman trying to be a reasonable leader, nothing more. Back in the castle city of New Domino, the mood among the people was grim. Word had gone out about the defeat at the hands of the Caputo family, and it had settled over the population like a fog. They'd succeeded in removing the noble class, yes, but fear about what came next hadn't gone away. Too many people had been lost in the war, and now ordinary citizens were left wondering what exactly this new government was planning to do for them. Inside the castle, Ukyo, as they knew him privately, had assembled his top officials. This wasn't a casual meeting. It was a course correction for a country he had just taken over. The officials sat with tense faces, waiting on words from a leader who had never been known for going easy on anyone. opened by going straight at the most uncomfortable topic, their recent military loss. His gaze landed hard on the official responsible for foreign relations with the Kingdom of Arcana. The man practically flinched when his name came up, very much aware that his position was in serious danger. The official tried to defend himself. They'd been up against a sorcerer capable of wiping out tens of thousands in moments, he said. He argued that his value to the new government, given his role in the previous uprising, still made him indispensable. Rebuttal was immediate. Would the families of those soldiers find that logic acceptable? A failure was a failure, and responsibility had to be taken. Decision was already made. The official would be brought before the people, let them pass judgment. Even as the man threw himself on the ground begging, Shun didn't waver for a second. He gave a short signal, and the guards hauled the man out of the room, his pleadings swallowed up behind the closing door. Once that was handled, Shun shut the door, slapped his hand on the table, and refocused. He was done with distractions. The real issues needed attention now. The officials who were left didn't dare make a sound. He pushed back on the idea of immediately seeking peace with the Kingdom of Arcana after losing just one battle. To him, sending what amounted to a polite apology was cowardice. His position was that they should bring every divine treasure in their possession to the table, use that as leverage, rather than going in with nothing and begging for terms. Before they ended up in a position of asking for forgiveness, Shun said they needed to build themselves a better bargaining position first. He laid out clear instructions. The officials were to develop a plan while he was away. He had somewhere to be, and he expected real results when he returned. His final warning before leaving was the one that landed heaviest. Anyone who pulled something strange or tried to run from their responsibilities while he was gone, they were done. Not just them, their entire families, no exceptions. Failure he could potentially work with. Betrayal was a death sentence, full stop. With eyes that made everyone in the room uncomfortable, Shun demanded their best thinking if they valued staying alive. He needed to know the message had gotten through to every single person there. Accountability was not negotiable. After the meeting wrapped up, Shun was alone and visibly drained. He felt like he was stuck inside a broken business simulation, surrounded by people who couldn't seem to figure out the basics. Running an actual country was turning out to be far more exhausting than he'd imagined, especially when everything seemed to fall on him. And on top of all of that, he was now heading alone into enemy territory. Among his followers, a small debate broke out over who was best equipped to support him in what was coming. Shun didn't have much patience for any of it. The debate wasn't going to change the fact that a dangerous journey was already waiting for him. A heated argument flared up between the two women. The spear user made a cutting remark about small weapons being a sign of small thinking. Her rival shot back that acting superior was really just hiding how little courage she actually had. The whole thing came to a forced stop when their master ordered both of them firmly to drop it and act with some dignity. In the middle of all that tension, Elixir just started laughing, genuinely entertained, complimenting the master on how decisive that had been. As far as Elixir was concerned, the enthusiasm from both women came from a genuine desire to be useful to the person they served, even if that person looked a little burdened by all the admiration being thrown their way. Elixir then brought the focus back around, reminding them to set their egos aside, given that their master was about to walk into dangerous enemy territory. In a calmer voice, she asked them to stand together for this. Both women, still looking slightly irritated, agreed to a temporary truce thanks to Elixir stepping in. Their master let out a long breath, wishing Elixir had intervened a bit sooner. Conversation moved to the goal still unfinished. With quiet certainty, he made it clear he wasn't stopping until everything he'd set out to accomplish was done. But behind that resolve, shadows from the past crept back in. Images of a city reduced to rubble, of people cut down on the Emperor's orders. Those memories stirred a deep, cold anger. Silently, he swore to himself that he would erase every trace of the Emperor's bloodline from this world, even if it cost him his life. Out at the border of Caputo's territory, the sight of the enormous crater left by the battle was stark and unsettling. The king, standing on the fortress wall, noticed that the group he'd been expecting had finally arrived. He felt certain that anyone who came face to face with that kind of destruction would lose their nerve to oppose his kingdom. In his mind, the dignity of the royal family meant nothing compared to national interest, and he was fully confident his plan to pressure the enemy into compliance would work. As the carriages rolled through the gate, the king made his position clear: no more performances. If he decided they lacked integrity, he wouldn't hesitate to demand reparations and send them packing. But his top priority right now was ending what he considered a pointless war. The group was received and led toward the guest quarters in the Caputo estate. Their footsteps echoed through the grand corridors as they walked in, unaware that eyes were already tracking them from the shadows. Inside the room they were led to, their master sat still and composed. Around him, shadows of weapons were beginning to materialize out of nowhere. master. In another part of the estate, a heavy-set noble confirmed that everything was proceeding according to plan, sipping his drink with a slow, satisfied smile. A report came in. The hired men were already moving toward the sorcerer's cabin inside the Caputo estate. The noble listened carefully, knowing exactly who was inside. More than just hired muscle, elite soldiers had also been deployed to make sure the mission succeeded. But there was one strict order that had to be followed. Mistress Rain was not to be harmed, not even slightly. With a dismissive laugh, the noble gave the order to take out the heirs of all 4 other noble families. He felt they'd been foolish to side with the rebels. As far as he was concerned, their lives had lost all value the moment they'd refused to support him. His ambition was this: once the sorcerer and those heirs were gone, the war would escalate again. And from there, he'd have Mistress Rain fully under his control, with a position of honor waiting for him on the other side. As he sat there imagining his victory, he mocked the decisions made by the king and the noble family heads, convinced they'd made a fatal error. He couldn't wait to watch them all come crawling on their knees when they finally realized he'd been right all along. There was a moment of hesitation when he asked about the guards the heirs had brought with them. Hearing that it was just Rain's adoptive father and the wielder of Pandora, he felt his stomach drop slightly. He knew exactly how dangerous Pandora's power was capable of killing hundreds all at once. His counter was numbers. Surround them, swarm them with sheer volume. In his view, even the Sword Saint was one person. There was only so much one person could do against thousands. This war wasn't ending until every last rebel was gone. Down a corridor of the mansion, masked assassins took position outside their master's door. With a short command to take him alive, they broke the door down and moved to seize him. That surprise assault was met with immediate resistance. Already alert, the master stood up and scoffed at their attempt to take down a revolutionary. He was fast, very fast. In seconds, he'd already turned the attack around. With his weapon drawn and pressed against a cornered opponent, he told them, calm and cold, that they'd need another 100 years of practice before they could touch him. The blood already spilled made it very clear this wasn't someone to take lightly. He told them flatly they'd made the wrong choice coming after him. Opposing him was a mistake that couldn't be undone. He was right. The next attack that came at him met nothing but empty air as he stepped aside without even breaking rhythm. Instead of his blade, he pulled out a small mirror. The light caught in it triggered something unexpected. Suddenly, thousands of ceramic jars were appearing out of thin air and burying the attackers in an avalanche of clay and broken pottery. The corridor erupted into chaos, filled with the sound of panicked yelling disappearing under the crash. He just laughed at the sight of it. None of this was surprising. He'd been through attempted ambushes enough times to recognize the pattern. Without another second's delay, he was already gone, leaving his attackers buried and scrambling. His followers started piecing together what had happened. Their best guess was that a specific group, likely those opposed to the peace, had set this trap. But beneath the worry, they noticed something else. Their master looked genuinely energized, more alive than he'd been in a while. He admitted it openly, laughing a little. Nothing got him going quite like someone trying to end him. His followers gently pointed out that he was absolutely covered in mess, but that light-hearted moment got cut short without warning. A sharp burst of wind magic sliced through the air toward them. The blast obliterated the pile of jars nearby, sending shards everywhere. There was a sorcerer on the other side. Things had just gotten more complicated. The master took stock of the situation. He was surrounded, and this wasn't a group to underestimate. The attackers felt like they had him. Surely he couldn't get away from here. But just as they were about to press in, something slammed into the ceiling of the corridor from above, hard enough to shake the floor, and everything stopped. The ground vibrated as a heavily armored warrior landed right in the middle of the chaos, perfectly positioned. The moment that figure touched down, the atmosphere in the corridor shifted completely. It was Ekasach's. The women reacted with surprise. The attackers just saw a new target that needed to be handled. The armored knight, however, was already a step ahead. In a loud, clear voice, Ekasach called out a wall of blinding light. The flash was so intense it took out everyone's vision at once, and in that moment of total confusion, the counterattack began. Through the chaos of enemies who couldn't see, the knight moved, leaping, swinging, bringing that massive sword down with precision and speed that made the whole fight look one-sided. The resistance collapsed. The knight moved through them like a ghost, slipping in and out of their blind spots. One attacker tried to hold his ground, but he had to face the hard truth that the speed difference was just not something he could bridge. Once things had calmed down and the attackers were dealt with, the master asked, with a tone that was actually curious, whose side the armored figure was really on. The answer came from a young man who identified himself as part of the Kingdom of Arcana. Manga. Meanwhile, the scene shifted to a wide open field under moonlight, very quiet. In the distance, a group of armed figures moved carefully through the shadows toward a small cabin. Outside that cabin, the lady was already aware they were there. Calmly, she confirmed with Sansui, her loyal attendant, that he would follow her orders without question. Sansui affirmed his loyalty without hesitation. The order the lady gave was cold and absolute. She wanted Sansui to eliminate every single one of the intruders. Leave no one. Sansui accepted without flinching, though even as he did, his mind was already working through how to handle the bloodshed that was about to come. Under a quiet night sky, Sansui let out a long, slow breath and rolled his neck to work out the stiffness. He was standing in the middle of what anyone else would call a crisis, surrounded by a mob of armed men carrying torches, and yet he looked less like a man in danger and more like someone trying to figure out the most efficient way to clear a blocked drain. The guys closing in on him, for their part, hadn't quite figured out yet what they were actually up against. He just stood there, calm, letting the tension settle over the field like fog. The leader of the group finally snapped to the realization that their presence had been completely clocked. He shouted for his men to attack, but before anyone could actually move, Sansui was already in motion, moving at a speed that was honestly hard to follow with the naked eye. He didn't even bother drawing his sword, just used the scabbard. One precise movement, a single clean kick, and the leader was face down in the dirt, completely helpless. For his crew watching from a few feet away, that was enough to kick off a full-blown panic. Their whole defense had just crumbled in about 2 seconds. Without much hurry, Sansui picked up the sword that had fallen from the downed man. One swing, just one, and the person in front of him was gone. Clean, quick. For Sansui, honestly, it seemed like taking a life wasn't much more effort than finishing a routine chore. Fresh blood dripped from the blade he was holding, but the look on his face wasn't satisfaction. If anything, he seemed mildly annoyed. He muttered something low under his breath, clearly unhappy with how poor the quality of that sword was. Meanwhile, the bandits still standing could barely function. They were just frozen there, watching their guys go down that fast. He swung again and took out another one, but his attention was still mostly on the weapon itself. These swords hadn't been maintained at all, dull, basically useless. With an almost tired kind of disappointment, he tossed it aside and started walking through the crowd, scanning around, hoping to find something at least a little more worth using. He kept moving through his enemies like he was browsing a market stall, quietly hoping that at least one of them had the decency to carry something decent. Every time someone tried to take a shot at him, he'd deflect and put them down with the kind of efficiency that looked almost like a dance, like the chaos around him wasn't even registering. Bodies kept hitting the ground and still, nothing. Sword after sword got tossed away the moment he decided it wasn't worth his time. At this point, dealing with bad weapons was genuinely more frustrating to him than the fact that he was outnumbered. Fear was starting to shift into something closer to desperation for the bandits. They were yelling at each other to rush him, to pile on before he grabbed another weapon off the ground. But Sansui was too quick for that, slipping through their formation like a shadow they couldn't get a hand on. As he closed in on one of the attackers, Sansui found himself thinking this wasn't going to last much longer given the gap in ability. From a distance, Daoya and the others were watching the whole thing, and Daoya noticed something that genuinely unsettled him. Sansui was going for the neck, every single time, with an accuracy that left absolutely no room for error. Daoya explained it to the others, this wasn't magic. Sansui wasn't drawing on any extraordinary physical power either. He was simply using the weight of the blade and driving it straight into the gaps between the joints. That moment earlier when Sansui had stretched his neck, that wasn't just habit or a warm-up. He'd been mapping out the anatomy, pinpointing exactly where to strike for a perfect cut. That realization sent a chill through the person standing next to Daoya. They were watching what might actually be the strongest swordsman who had ever lived, which made the obvious question even harder to ignore. Why would someone like that be willing to take orders and work under someone else? Daoya got into it, explained the whole setup. The Sopid family guaranteed Rain's safety, and in return they had Sansui's absolute loyalty. It was a mutual arrangement, a genuine exchange, very different from how a typical mercenary operates. This wasn't just a contract, it was something much more solid. But then the conversation shifted to the other side's trump card, Shun Yukio, the one they called the Ponderer. Apparently, Shun was the only person in 10,000 years who had a perfect compatibility with Pandora. Even if Sansui were to face him directly, the odds of winning were considered close to non-existent. Meanwhile, on a different part of the field, a group of hooded assassins was moving in. They knew the fight had already already started and they were aiming to move fast and secure their target. But they stopped short when they noticed something strange, odd metal objects planted in the ground ahead of them, which they immediately suspected was some kind of trap. Before they could figure it out, a neatly dressed man stepped out of the dark and greeted them very politely, almost pleasantly. It was Shun Yukio. He kept his tone easy and calm, even going so far as to express something like sympathy that they had to pull overtime on a night like this. Then, from behind Shun, a mysterious woman appeared and the assassins immediately tensed up. They recognized her. It was Pandora. Having Shun show up here of all places had completely pulled the rug out from under their entire plan. Not wasting any time, the assassins launched a wind blade magic attack, hoping to eliminate Shun before he could tap into Pandora's power. The spell hit him dead on. There was a small explosion that would have been more than enough to finish off any ordinary person. But Shun was still standing, not a scratch on him, though his clothes were pretty torn up from the blast. In the middle of all that, Pandora started teasing him, reaching over to touch the exposed section of his stomach. Shun, clearly not amused, told her plainly to knock it off. They were still on the clock. The assassins were trembling now. The reality sinking in that magic simply didn't work on him. Shun didn't even make it a guessing game. He just stated outright what they were there for: to take the young girl with imperial blood. Under that cold, steady gaze of his, whatever nerve they had left just evaporated, and they started to grasp that they'd walked straight into the den of something far worse than they'd bargained for. Shun looked at them with something close to contempt, making it clear that even if they succeeded, there'd be nothing to be proud of. He reminded them, almost mockingly, that their own country wouldn't even give them credit for it, no matter how loyal they thought they were being. And while his enemies stood there crumbling inside, something massive began to stir in the shadows behind him, radiating a pressure that made the air feel heavier. The name Pandora rang out into the night as Shun released what he was truly capable of. Heavy, metallic sounds began clashing and resonating, signaling that something terrifying was taking shape. The woman behind him started to merge and fold into a mechanism, a vast, layered suit of armor assembling around her, while Shun himself seemed to be burning from the inside with barely contained rage. And there it stood in front of the soldiers who could barely hold themselves together, a towering knight clad in jet-black armor, eyes burning bright. Just its presence alone was suffocating, like death had decided to put on a face and walk toward them. Every step it took made the ground feel like it was giving way beneath it. In a heavy, resonant voice, the knight challenged them to try and take it down if they really wanted their country back. On the other side of the field, an entirely different kind of dread was playing out. Sansui stood motionless in the middle of a field of fallen enemies, sword still drawn, having apparently wrapped things up with unsettling efficiency. The remaining intruders were spiraling into panic, fully aware now that they were up against something that wore a human shape but didn't operate like a human. Cornered and out of options in a direct fight, they decided to go underhanded, shifting focus toward the girls nearby and trying to use them as leverage. They broke into a sprint toward Hapain and the others. Sansui glanced over with a completely flat expression, like he'd already seen that move coming from the moment the fight began. The furious charge they threw at him meant absolutely nothing. In one fluid, nearly invisible movement, Sansui sidestepped and used one of their own bodies as a stepping stone. It was the kind of moment that made the gap between them feel impossible to measure. Blood scattered as Sansui ended their resistance in an instant. The soldiers who had been watching their comrades fall that effortlessly, their courage just broke. They dropped their weapons and went down on their knees, begging for their lives. Sansui showed nothing, no anger, no pity. He told them plainly that surrendering didn't change anything because this was always going to be how it ended for them. One of them pleaded, mentioned his family. Sansui replied quietly that he had a family too, one he needed to protect, and then delivered the final blow. Once things settled down, Hapain walked over with a krill, a warm smile on her face. She offered her praise for what Sansui had done. The area was completely clear, not a trace of threat left behind. He knelt respectfully to receive it, though he felt the whole thing had taken longer than it should have. Hapain looked around at the scene, clean work, even if the surroundings were soaked in blood, and seemed entirely satisfied with how it had all played out. She felt a quiet pride knowing that Arcana's strongest knight had never once let her down. She even started thinking out loud about letting a few witnesses live, just so word could spread about what Sansui was capable of. The surviving prisoners who heard that just stood there, trembling, as their fate was discussed like a business decision. Then the mood shifted. Hapain decided she had no further use for the remaining men. With a single short command, she left it in Sansui's hands. Without hesitation, without any visible inner conflict, he drew his sword again to finish what was left of the night's chaos. Elsewhere, in a quieter part of the compound, a few people were keeping watch couch beside the bed of a sleeping girl. Outside had finally gone silent, and they were allowing themselves to hope carefully that the danger had truly passed after all that had happened. Back outside, heavy footsteps began approaching Happin's group. Pandora's massive suit of armor came walking in, drawing every eye in the area without even trying. Akrill stared at it up close and looked genuinely stunned, calling it a legendary disaster armor, a name that felt about right. Even from a few meters away, the sheer weight of power radiating from Pandora was hard to ignore, pressing into the space around it. Then, just like that, the armor dissolved, and the woman inside stepped out and immediately clung to Shun with no shame whatsoever. Shun, for his part, looked drained and a little cranky. He started complaining that the enemies tonight had been a real letdown, not even close to giving him anything to work with. Pandora and Akrill both started teasing him for taking such weak opponents so seriously. Through all the back and forth, Sansui just watched in quiet bewilderment, thinking to himself that the people around him with real power were, honestly, a pretty unusual bunch. Happin shifted the subject, wondering out loud how things were going at the other locations. She had a feeling that the others, including Saiga, had already taken care of their respective situations. And she was right. Over at Caputo Mansion, there was still a battle in full swing against some very dangerous creatures. Saiga was something else to watch, moving fast enough to almost multiply surrounding enemies with afterimages. With the steady composure of someone who'd done this many times before, she was setting up to close out the last of the intruders who had been bold enough to disturb their territory. A devastating flash of a strike brought down the enemy in a single sweep. In the aftermath, the bitter truth landed. They'd walked straight into a flawless trap. With no time and no room left to rethink anything, the only sensible call was to fall back immediately before things got any worse. The slashes kept coming, relentless, cutting through the enemy's guard faster than they could react. When the storm of attacks finally stilled, she stood there composed, having confirmed there was nothing left to deal with, and then, from nearby, another figure appeared, carrying that same unnerving aura. The area was clear. Someone spoke up to compliment the level of skill they'd just witnessed, saying it belonged right up there alongside Sansui's. But in the quiet that followed, both their gazes settled on the broken mask of one of the fallen enemies. Neither said anything for a moment. The image of Sansui's raw power was still fresh in their minds. It was hard to wrap their heads around how someone this strong could have been put down that easily by him. And then slowly, one of them started feeling it, that creeping sense of inadequacy, the realization that their own grasp on their abilities still had a long way to go. The thought surfaced, almost against their will. Sansui probably could have handled all of it alone. That feeling of being useless settled in heavy enough that the tears just came. There was no stopping them. But before that spiral could go any deeper, their companion stepped in with a sharp, direct reality check, no sugarcoating. They went through it, the lack of real commitment, the blamming of poor weapons, and finally, the hardest part, being made to sit with the simple truth that this time they had genuinely lost. The pushback kept coming, reminding them of everything that had gone wrong because of them. It stung, but the point of all of it wasn't to break them down. Behind all the harshness was a real effort to pull them back up. And beyond all the personal stumbles, one thing was undeniable: they had helped secure their country's future. That was no small thing. That was worth holding onto. Support started coming in from the others, confirming that what they'd done that night had genuinely mattered. With that, some of their spirits started coming back. They pulled themselves together and got ready to report back on the mission, confident that whoever was in charge would recognize the effort they'd put in. On the other side of things, everything that could be done independently was done. What happened next was out of their hands. It was up to the king and the parties involved. Meanwhile, a corrupt noble who'd been lounging comfortably was suddenly jolted out of his ease when guards burst in and took him down before he could say a word. He erupted in confusion and anger as he was forced to his knees. When he looked up, the king was already there, flanked by key figures. This was the moment. The real negotiations, the ones that could actually end all of this, were about to begin. The violent night across Caputo territory finally wrapped up as dawn started to show. Sansui and the other trump card holders, along with the heirs, were summoned to appear before the King of Arcana in person. Behind them, a massive crater in the earth stood as a silent reminder of just how fierce the night had been. Up on the castle walls, the gathering took on a very formal tone. Sharp gazes came from all directions, landing on the young man and making him feel more than a little out of place standing among this many influential people. Representatives from various factions were present, including an elegantly dressed woman in a kimono who added a certain weight to the atmosphere. Then, in the middle of all that tension, a visibly miserable Nuri was brought forward, drawing immediate sharp reactions from those assembled. The king fixed his gaze on Nuri and spoke bluntly. bluntly, calling him useless and saying he'd gone too far. Nuri tried to defend himself, almost hysterical, insisting he'd been set up by someone who wanted to bring him down. The king didn't budge an inch. Then the truth started coming out. The king had known everything from the start. Nuri's face shifted as he began to understand with mounting horror that every move he'd made had been watched. The invitation he'd sent out had backfired completely. The royal side had used him as bait the whole time, drawing all the trouble out into the open. The king walked through just how sloppy Nuri's security had been lately, which had made everything on their end much easier to pull off. As a way of settling the matter, he put a substantial offer on the table: extradite every noble who had fled to the kingdom and hand over all their assets as compensation. That gave the other side pause. Logically, their country had almost no grounds to turn down an offer that generous, especially as a show of genuine goodwill toward peace. But the young man didn't just go along with it. He pushed back, asking what the kingdom was actually getting out of a deal that looked so one-sided. He wanted a straight answer before he'd sign off on anything. The king dropped the pretense and told him plainly this had been a test all along. He wanted to see whether the person leading the other side understood what good governance actually looked like. Unlike Nuri, who'd been too hungry for personal gain to see straight, this young man was supposed to be capable of looking past the surface. The king spelled out the hidden risk. If the young man had just accepted without thinking, assuming it meant the kingdom was weak, he would have pulled his country into a diplomatic trap, potentially locking them into a subordinate position, obligated to follow Arcana's lead going forward. The king admitted that getting what he wanted without having to go through a war was his preferred outcome. But before wrapping things up, he tossed in one more condition, a final concession that would need to be agreed upon to complete the peace deal. The king opened with something significant. There was a girl currently under his kingdom's protection. Word had spread that she carried the bloodline of a former Domino emperor. Without involving any sacred treasures, the king stated directly that the pursuit of this girl needed to stop. That caught the other side off guard. Akio responded by asking whether the king was genuinely willing to put his country's reputation on the line for a request like this. For the king, a small mark against his name was a trivial price for getting this problem resolved. From where Sansui stood, watching all of it, he couldn't help but notice just how skillfully the king had been steering the whole conversation to this point. The king pressed on the idea that protecting those under his care, including their families, was a fundamental responsibility, one the other side should understand too. On top of that, winter was closing in and people needed supplies to survive. That hit a nerve for Akio, pulling up painful memories of what had been done to his land. It came back to him, the image of his city, set ablaze by the emperor simply because he had refused to give up the sacred treasure. The regret was deep. He found himself thinking, if only he had complied back then, maybe his people would still be alive. No personal vengeance was worth more than the welfare of whoever was left. Quietly, with what felt like the weight of everything he'd carried, he went down on one knee. Akio announced that he was surrendering himself and his sacred treasure and asked only for mercy for his people. The king welcomed this with genuine warmth, addressing him now as Mr. Akio. They agreed to move forward together, including a promise of aid to see his people through the coming winter. The tension that had been sitting over everything started to lift as the king formalized their partnership. Sansui allowed himself to exhale, for real this time, understanding that Rain was no longer in danger from any of this. To help things run smoothly going forward, the king introduced his eldest daughter, Stendo Arcana, as the official government representative. He expressed hope that the working relationship, and even the personal one, would develop well over time. Akio rose and took the princess's offered hand, marking the start of something new. A few onlookers exchanged knowing smiles, but that handshake carried real weight. It was the symbol of peace that both sides genuinely needed. Not everyone was on board, though. A Domino nobleman let his anger out, accusing the royal family of having a hidden agenda, planning to seize the throne through bloodlines. He insisted that Domino simply couldn't be governed without the backing of longtime nobles like himself. He kept pushing, telling anyone who'd listen that Akio was just a foreign outsider who'd armed starving people and would inevitably turn on them. Faced with the disruption, the king stayed composed and turned to Shun for his take. Shun offered a measured suggestion: let the people of Domino themselves prove the nobleman's accusations wrong. The king found that entirely reasonable and immediately ordered the guards to remove the disruptive nobleman from his presence. After that disturbance was sorted out, the king turned his attention to Sansui and expressed genuine gratitude for everything he'd contributed. Sansui felt he'd only done what he could, but the recognition from the king still made him bow respectfully, followed by quiet laughter from those around him. The king also acknowledged Shuzu for the exceptional loyalty he'd shown throughout all of this. Peace had been achieved without losing anyone, and that outcome had a lot to do with the roles they'd all played. Shuzu pledged to keep giving everything he had in service of the kingdom. Even those who felt their contribution was smaller than Sansui's received fair praise from the king. For all of them, hearing those words from the ruler himself was a genuine honor, the kind that stayed with you. Then the atmosphere changed fast. The name Suiboku came up. The moment Sansui acknowledged being his student, the people around him visibly recoiled. For them, Suiboku wasn't just a name, it was something they associated with terror. The idea that such a person would have a student at all was almost unthinkable. That fear turned into something volatile, sudden anger aimed directly at Sansui. But Pandora flatly refused any suggestion of harming Suiboku's student, knowing full well it would make Shun despise her. In the middle of all that uproar, Ukyao, unfamiliar with the name, started quietly wondering just who this Suiboku actually was. Someone explained, Suiboku was an immortal ascetic, a figure whose power was on par with a god's. In the past, he had brought entire nations to ruin with his own hands. The fact that someone that powerful now had a successor wasn't the kind of thing anyone could afford to treat as trivial. Someone gestured toward the massive crater visible behind them and suggested that Suiboku's student was probably responsible for that level of destruction. Shuzu was honest about it though, that had been his own doing. In honor of the soldiers who had lost their lives, Ukyao suggested Shuzu demonstrate a bit of his ability, as a kind of tribute in lieu of a formal salute. The king hadn't seen Shuzu's magic firsthand and was curious. After getting the go-ahead from Miss Palette, Shuzu readied himself to release a single fire spell into the sky. With one surge of power, an enormous fireball tore through the air above them. The sheer scale of it, the raw, terrifying force on display, left everyone watching completely speechless, all of them quietly registering just how much power was now on their side. Then, without warning, everyone's attention was yanked upward. Something large was dropping out of the sky, coming down fast, and whoever caught a glimpse of it couldn't believe what they were seeing. A massive ship fell from the sky and slammed into the ground with tremendous force. The impact sent a wave of dust and debris exploding outward, leaving a fresh crater in the middle of the area. Up on the fortress walls, soldiers and the protagonist alike could only stand there and stare at the wreckage spread out in front of them. Through the rolling smoke, two figures emerged, and they were not happy. Keisaudanua immediately erupted, demanding to know who had dared attack them like that. Beside her, Hakabunanoa was sobbing, still in shock from the whole thing. The people on the walls immediately recognized who they were looking at. Full of emotion, they accused everyone of trying to hurt them again, even assuming that monster had come back for them. Hakabunanoa, still crying, was convinced only Suiboku could pull off something this insane. The protagonist stood there in awkward silence, looking genuinely remorseful about what had just happened to both of them. Seeing how bad the misunderstanding had gotten, the others rushed to calm things down. They explained that it had been a complete accident. Their ship had gotten caught in the path of a magic demonstration the royal sorcerer had been performing at the king's request. No one had meant for any of this to happen, but the result was still a wrecked flying vessel. A sincere apology went out for the whole mess, but buried under the chaos of it all, something significant had quietly come together. With everyone now in the same place, all 8 sacred treasures were officially united, and they were now in Arcana's hands. It felt like a genuinely historic moment, all of the legendary relics, gathered together at the same time for the first time. In that atmosphere, one of them stepped forward and asked the sacred treasures to lend their wisdom and strength to help the people who were struggling, the ones living in poverty and hardship. The request was received warmly. As long as Elixir and the others were willing, Danua and Noah were ready to step in and help solve the problems at hand. With that settled, the Kingdom of Arcana officially held the full strength of all 8 sacred treasures, and with it, the foundation for something better. Plans started taking shape quickly. Danua, with the ability to produce food, would head straight for Domino's capital. Noah, who could fly, would travel with the Caputo family. And through all of this, the protagonist found himself learning more and more about the shadowy past of his enigmatic teacher. But above all the politics and power and grand planning, there was something far more personal pressing on the protagonist's mind. He broke away from everything and headed straight for a small wooden structure on the edge of the grounds. Someone very important was waiting there. The moment he saw Rain, he pulled her into a warm hug without hesitation. She'd been frightened for so long, but being in his arms, she finally let herself breathe again. He spoke to her gently, told her how brave she'd been, and reassured her that everything was okay now. He also reminded her softly not to forget to thank everyone who had helped them get through this. With a full heart, Rain thanked each one of the allies who had fought for them, and with that, the long, exhausting war finally came to a close, and peace, real peace, found its way back to the land. One by one, the carriages carrying the most powerful and influential figures in the realm started pulling away from the fortress, heading back to their respective homes. Inside the carriages, the mood had loosened considerably. People were chatting, the kind of light back and forth that only happens once the hard part is over. Not everyone was content, though. In one of the other carriages, a woman was making her displeasure well known, irritated to be sharing space with Noah and Danua in Arcana. She even muttered, somewhat bluntly, that those two were proving far more useful than her travel companion, who responded to that with nothing more than a long, weary sigh. A minor argument broke out over Noah and Danua's status, someone framing them as tools that just moved from hand to hand with no fixed owner. The atmosphere got a little spiky with all the bruised egos in the mix, but the journey kept moving regardless, on toward wherever came next. On a different road entirely, the return trip was feeling genuinely pleasant for one girl who couldn't stop talking about it. She was riding high off the whole adventure and wishing her grandfather Biobu could have experienced it alongside her. Seeing all 8 sacred treasures together in one place, honestly, that was a once-in-a-lifetime thing. There was a faint sense that something difficult might be coming down the road, but she brushed it off, staying upbeat and confident that her grandfather would handle it if something actually came up. Her grandfather, for his part, let out a quiet, resigned breath, sensing, probably, that their peaceful days were numbered and that things were about to get very busy again before long. The war with Domino was finally over, and life at the Dewey estate had settled back into its usual rhythm. The nobles who'd tried to use Rain to seize back power had been dealt with completely. Watching the morning training session, Sansui felt relieved that Lord Ukyao had given up his pursuit of Rain, largely thanks to the king's intervention. But something about the way Seiga and Town swung their swords bothered him, like their minds were somewhere else, somewhere they shouldn't be. Rain wondered aloud whether Seiga really needed 5 more years just to master the basics. Sansui insisted the fundamentals mattered, but he also warned Seiga to face the weaknesses he still carried. Sansui laid out the 2 problems holding Seiga back. He leaned too hard on precognition, and he wasted mana constantly. The fix was a swordsmanship form that could blend different spells smoothly, something only disciplined practice could build. When Seiga asked if Sansui used a technique of his own, the answer caught everyone off guard. Sansui said he didn't need one, he could produce a perfect motion instantly in any moment. Town was floored. Brower was so startled she spilled her tea. Sansui added that repetition mattered for beginners, but sloppy form would always wreck a fighter's tactics in the end. The sparring session began. Sansui told Seiga to react properly to every strike, then opened with a strike straight at his head to test him. Unlike before, when Seiga used to flinch and close his eyes at the last second, this time he forced himself to keep moving forward into the attack. His swing was still too wide. Sansui stopped him cold with one open palm to the face. Even though the attack failed, Sansui praised Seiga for daring to break his usual pattern. Rain asked whether this monk-style training would actually amount to anything, and Tezuka cut in to keep things moving. Sansui explained how a true martial artist learns to read the world around them by watching how wild animals hunted, studying what made a hunt succeed or fail. To him, hunting in the wild was real combat. That's where his instincts for strategy had come from. He remembered his master laughing when he finally understood the lesson. Town realized the old master had pushed Sansui to learn from nature itself rather than sit and meditate. The point was staying observant, keeping your eyes open. Ultimately, it all came down to discipline. Sansui sighed, wishing his master had just told him sooner. Rain and Tezuka were baffled that he'd been left to figure it all out alone for years. Sansui knew his method was strange, probably impossible to teach to anyone else. He decided to keep doing things his own way. Meanwhile, the capital's main square was buzzing louder than usual. A public notice had stirred up the crowd. The organizers were calling for strong warriors to challenge Shirokuro Sansui, the swordsman of House Sopid, with fame and glory promised to anyone bold enough to try. People mocked the idea, dismissing Sansui as just a kid who couldn't possibly live up to the rumors. Among the eager challengers gathering nearby, Ran watched from a distance with a knowing smile. Back home, Sansui was practicing with his wooden sword when he sensed someone approaching with confident, heavy steps. It was Ran, trailed by her followers. She wasted no time challenging him, demanding to know if he really was the strongest swordsman in the country, as everyone claimed. Brimming with confidence, Ran declared her ambition to beat him and become the best herself. She charged in fast, swinging with everything she had. Sansui shut the attack down easily. Ran was stunned at how solid his defense was. To him, her movements were raw, clearly someone with little real combat experience. One quick motion ended it. His wooden blade landed clean, sending Ran flying. A stunned silence fell over the arena before her followers' disbelief broke through, their champion beaten without landing a single hit. They couldn't process it. How could Ran lose that fast? Fear and awe mixed together as they realized the man in front of them really was the strongest swordsman alive. They rushed to Ran's side, tending to her while mourning what felt like an impossible defeat. All this attention was wearing on Sansui. Ever since that strange notice went up, more and more challengers kept showing up. He just wanted somewhere quieter to deal with it. Across the campus courtyard, Dewey stood with his usual confidence, waiting for the show he'd set up. A crowd of rough-looking men had gathered, exactly as promised. Dewey loudly offered a big reward to anyone who could land even one hit on Sansui. The bait worked. Fighters hungry for the prize lined up, with no idea what they were walking into. Watching from the side, Town was impressed that one notice could draw this many people, a proof of Sansui's growing reputation. Sansui just gave a tired smile, wiping cold sweat from his brow, uneasy about facing such a crowd. But the challengers were already restless, urging him not to hold back. Dewey kept stoking the fire, telling Sansui to wipe them all out without mercy. Sansui found the whole thing excessive, but the men only felt insulted. One big guy in particular took offense, convinced he alone was more than enough to take Sansui down. The fight started. The challenger sneered, asking if Sansui was ready, and got a calm smile in response. Go ahead, strike first. Sansui drew his wooden sword, his stance steady, a sharp contrast to the nerves he'd felt minutes earlier. The first brutal swing came in hard, but Sansui slipped past it with barely any effort and dropped the man instantly. His friends weren't deterred. They wrote it off as luck and started pushing each other to go next. One by one, they stepped up, and one by one they fell. Sansui moved like a shadow, taking each one down with technique that was beautiful and lethal at once. Town watched, awestruck. Sega sensed something different in him now, something even stronger than before. Dewey took the praise in stride, like the outcome had been obvious all along. Happin found the whole thing absurd, but Dewey was proud. If Sansui really was this strong, no one had any business doubting him. Ekisach noticed how Sansui met every challenger with a genuine smile, staying humble and warm even mid-fight. It reminded her of Suiboku in Sansui. She saw his master's calm and self-control living on. With things under control, Town excused himself to Sunny. He wanted to keep watching, but he had urgent business with the headmaster, a small negotiation but an important one for his country. Years earlier, the headmaster had agonized over a boy born without any magic. He'd hoped the child might carry rare or sacred magic instead, but reality proved harsher. The boy seemed incapable of using magic at all, a fatal flaw in their world. The memory surfaced again as he recalled apologizing to the boy's mother for the trouble. Now, sitting alone in his office, the headmaster felt how fast time had passed, reflecting on the choices that had brought him here. Town's arrival broke the silence. The headmaster apologized for keeping him waiting. Town brushed it off. Both men knew this meeting would benefit them equally. As agreed, Town would teach the school his shadow manipulation techniques. In return, he wanted royal magic knowledge to bring back to Magin, specifically the shadow descent and god's descent techniques. The headmaster firmly refused the second request. That one was a royal family secret, not something to hand out. Wanting the trade to stay fair, the headmaster offered healing magic as an equivalent exchange. Town was satisfied, glad to bring something genuinely valuable back to his country. The conversation shifted to Sansui's fight outside. Town felt fortunate to have met him, not just a strong fighter, but the embodiment of the ideals Town had always aspired to. The headmaster agreed, certain Sansui was the perfect successor to Suiboku. The scene moved to a carriage leaving campus campus. Dewey praised Sansui for proving his strength without seriously hurting anyone. Sansui brushed it off, insisting he still had a long way to go before matching his teacher. Happen thought Sansui's modesty was getting excessive. Rain said there was nothing wrong with her father feeling a little proud. Town joked that Sansui needed to learn to accept compliments or women would start hatting him. Sansui just sat there, confused as the carriage rolled on. Sansui calmly asked to step out for a moment like he had some small errand to handle. The door opened to a familiar sight, Ran and her group waiting in the open field with fierce determination on their faces. Ran greeted him confidently, saying they'd been waiting for this. Sansui responded coldly, disappointed she hadn't learned from their last meeting. Ran snapped, charging in with a furious yell, determined to take him down right there. The reckless attack ended in seconds. Ran hit the ground before she could land anything. Sheathing his sword, Sansui warned her firmly if she wanted another match, she should request it properly instead of ambushing him like this. He climbed back into the carriage calmly. When asked, he simply said he'd dealt with some rude people blocking the road. Brower and Happen just shook their heads, baffled that anyone could be so reckless and lacking in basic manners. Outside, Ran and her friends watched the carriage disappear, feelings tangled. The next day at the school garden, the mood was different. Seiga was fired up, vowing to keep training until he could surpass Sansui. Happen, still half asleep, gave a half-hearted response while Ekisach cheerfully praised her master's fighting spirit. They stopped short at a grim sight, a heap of defeated bodies piled across the field. Ran stood there, eyes sharp and intimidating, as if daring anyone to get in her way. Tension spiked when a beast-like creature suddenly attacked. Seiga nearly lost his footing in surprise, but Ekisach warned him in time to brace for the impact. The strike landed hard, sparks of energy flashing between them. Saiga, the beastman, growled in frustration at being blocked. Ran grew even angrier, shouting that she alone had the right to fight Sansui. Anyone else interfering would be treated as an obstacle to remove. Moving faster than the eye could follow, Ran lunged again, her assault so sudden and intense that her opponent was forced on the back foot. Saiga, purely on defense, realized he couldn't dodge an attack that fast. Ran unleashed a relentless barrage, each hit landing with full force, the air around them growing heavy with pressure. She kept pushing forward, giving him no room to strike back. Saiga held firm, protected by his magic armor. It was Ran's knuckles that split open from the force of her own blows. The pain didn't slow her down, if anything, she got more frustrated by his resilience. Ekisach praised Seiga for staying alert. Seeing Saiga start to falter, Sunny, also in beast form, stepped in, ordering him to fall back while she took over. She charged at Ran with overwhelming force to break her momentum. The hit landed clean, sending Ran flying and coughing from the impact. Saiga scolded Sunny for going too hard, but the tension in the air hadn't eased. This fight was far from over. Ran rose again, her stare darker than before. Her wounds were closing at an impossible speed, leaving Sunny stunned by the regeneration. Ran insisted on finishing this alone without anyone's help. Seeing their leader back on her feet, Ran's followers moved in to back her up. Watching from a distance, Ekisach noticed something odd about their clothing. It didn't look ordinary at all. The fight broke out again, messier this time. Saiga felt outmatched, like every move he made was already anticipated. In the chaos, Ekisach gave Seigo a sharp instruction: keep them at a distance, use fire magic to create space. He followed through, unleashing a wave of fire that swept the area. Ran's followers recoiled as the flames closed in, forcing them to retreat. A wall of fire now separated both sides. Saiga felt a flicker of relief. The enemy couldn't close in so easily anymore. Keeping distance seemed like the right call against Ran's unpredictable group. But fire wasn't enough to stop Ran. She jumped straight through it and slammed another hit into her opponent's face. To her, the stronger the enemy, the more satisfying it would be to bring them down. Saiga roared, humiliated by her words and her relentless attacks. Ran just smiled coldly, certain that any defense he put up now was pointless. Her presence suddenly surged, like she was calling up every ounce of hidden power inside her. With a dismissive look, she warned him it was all useless. Her strength, she claimed, knew no limit. The power flowed through her body, giving her arms terrifying strength and legs fast as lightning. Sunny watched, stunned, realizing Ran's body could heal almost any wound instantly. With pure arrogance, Ran declared herself the strongest martial artist alive, an unbeatable body to match. Facing Seiga, she swore she'd never know defeat. The clash that followed was fierce. Strike after strike came at blind blinding speed, kicking up clouds of dust. In the middle of it, Tezuka and Happen realized something surprising. Sunny was actually the one in control, slowly cornering her. Sunny, still in beast form, told Seiga to stay focused on his own opponent. Even as the fight raged, doubts crept in about how much longer Ran could keep this up. Ran kept insisting she had no limits, trying to convince herself as much as anyone, even as the brutal exchange continued. Sunny answered with quiet doubt right as her claws tore through Ran's defense, drawing blood. Ran laughed at first, mocking how many times she'd have to explain her immortality. But the laugh died fast when she realized the wound on her stomach wasn't closing. Sunny stared coldly as Ran weakened. Every creature has a limit, she said. Ran's fatal mistake was never learning where hers was. Believing herself invincible had blinded her to it. Ran's body finally collapsed, her friends crying out in panic. Sunny just scoffed, reminding everyone how Ran had claimed to be unbeatable and still couldn't even take her down. After the fight, Seiga rushed to Sunny, who'd returned to her human form. She asked, almost coy, if he saw her differently now. He answered with sincere praise, calling what she'd just done incredible. While Ran's friends scrambled to help her, Seiga asked how Sunny had known the limit of her opponent's regeneration. Sunny began explaining a rare phenomenon in her kingdom known as the Chosen. People like Ran, she said, were born with silver hair and extraordinary physical and regenerative gifts. In her country, these naturally gifted but battle-hungry fighters were called berserkers. The secret to beating one had been passed down through Majin's royal bloodline, relentless, unbroken pressure. But that method only worked for someone capable of channeling divine power. Curious, Seiga asked about the identities of the four others who'd come with Ran. Tezuka and Happine admitted they'd never seen clothing or magic like theirs before. Seiga could only guess until Ekasach spoke up, claiming she knew exactly who they were. She explained they were martial artists from Tempera village. She remembered fighting people with the same traits back when she belonged to Suiboku and confirmed they were dangerous opponents. Ekasach went on to explain how magic worked among humans. Most people were born with some magic, but the strength varied wildly. Certain families, however, inherited very specific, powerful traits. In this kingdom alone, there was the Ekasach family's magic, the Caputo family's magic, and the divine bloodline of Majin's royal family. What stunned Seiga most was learning that Tempera village had been founded by 10 people, each carrying one of these rare gifts. Seiga found it strange enough that a single bloodline like that was rare, and there were apparently many such families scattered across the world. Ekasach explained that every bloodline traced back to a founder, a genius among geniuses born with extraordinary power. These founders could use high-level techniques instinctively without ever being taught magic that came as naturally as breathing. The same applied to the berserker magic, which boosted physical ability unconsciously, but Ekasach warned it carried a brutal risk. If a berserker ran out of magic before their wounds finished healing, they would die. That fear became real when Ran's friends noticed her bleeding wasn't stopping. Desperate, they begged Seiga and the others to save her. The school's reception hall had been turned into an emergency ward, rows of beds filled with the injured. In one corner, Ran lay wrapped in bandages, her loyal followers gathered around her, faces tight with worry. Happin's father questioned the strangers about where they'd come from. Quietly, the girls explained they were from Tempera village, a branch family living for generations under the shadow of the main house. Back home, their abilities were known as rare magic, a legacy from 10 martial arts families, each mastering a different style. They spoke of Ran with pride, describing her as a natural genius whose power had shown even before she began formal training, already surpassing grown adults. With no rivals left in the village, Ran had set out to travel. Without hesitation, the girls had followed, certain she was destined for great things. Their faith had been unshakable that Ran would keep winning no matter where she went, but reality had crushed that belief. She'd been no match for the country's strongest swordsman, beaten by Sansui in an instant. The defeat to Sunny had been just as crushing. Her followers broke down crying over their unconscious leader while Sansui and the others just watched watched in silence. Hapen's father warned that even though Princess Sunny had stopped her this time, Ran remained dangerous. Once she woke up, he believed, her rage would erupt again uncontrolled. That warning sparked a wave of panic among Ran's followers until the door opened. King Arcana walked in with full authority, declaring that Ran's fate was his decision alone since the school answered directly to the royal family. Calmly, the king thanked Sunny for subduing the berserker, his presence underscoring the crown's role in resolving the chaos. He asked to personally take charge of the matter going forward. Killing a berserker, in his view, would be a waste, a missed opportunity too valuable to throw away. Losing 4 rare magic users at once was something the kingdom couldn't afford. He turned to Tezuka for expert advice, asking whether a curse could be placed on the berserker to stop her from going berserk again. Tezuka, though uncertain, said it was possible, but only with her consent. They all knew Ran's pride ran sky high, she might flatly refuse. The king figured they'd need to break that arrogance first. Hapen's father added that forcing anyone into submission without killing them was never easy, even against an ordinary opponent. Stroking his beard, the king concluded there was only one person suited for the job, the strongest swordsman in the country, who'd already beaten Ran twice. Elsewhere, Sansui sat with Dewey, Tezuka, and the others, the conversation turning to the berserker they'd just faced. Sansui admitted his master had never once taught him anything about berserkers. Seiga asked whether Sansui thought he could force Ran into full surrender. Sansui answered honestly, he couldn't guarantee what would happen after. Killing the threat for good would likely be easier than safely tamming her dangerous magic. Seiga understood plenty of people wanted that rare magic for themselves, but the final call would wait until they heard from someone important. Sansui nodded, sensing the next step would matter a great deal. Elsewhere on campus, the headmaster was lecturing on the philosophy of learning, explaining that growth was a string of successes and failures, with failure usually outnumbering success by far. Sansui stood at the doorway, waiting for the right moment to step in. The headmaster stressed that people learn the most from their mistakes. After wrapping up the lecture, he prepared to meet Sansui privately. In his office, the headmaster greeted him as Lightning Sword. Sansui, humble as ever, felt unworthy of the title and apologized instead for the chaos and injuries the berserker had caused, including what happened to Princess Sunny. He felt he'd failed to handle the situation properly despite getting 2 chances. The headmaster told him not to blame himself. Thanks to Sansui, the kingdom now had a real shot at gaining rare magic, an opportunity too good to waste. To the headmaster, the man in front of him was the perfect student, someone who'd spent years devoted entirely to the sword, holding absolute faith in every lesson he'd learned. But behind the praise lay a heavy burden. Even the Sopid family's elders recognized Sansui's worth. The headmaster knew how lucky they were to have him, but he also admitted the school couldn't always expect perfection. They had to be ready to fail and learn from it. With deep humility, the headmaster bowed low, asking Sansui to carry this heavy responsibility, certain he was the only one they could rely on. Sansui agreed to do his best, though he couldn't promise the outcome. The scene shifted to the Grand Academy Hall, heavy with a sense of regret. There, Sansui walked in to meet the injured soldiers. He bowed his head and sincerely apologized for all the trouble and pain he'd caused them. One badly wounded soldier eyed him skeptically, asking if he'd truly beaten the terrifying berserker before. To those who'd felt Ran's ferocity firsthand, beating something that powerful seemed impossible. Calmly, Sansui invited them to come watch his match against Ran the next day. Time passed and the day arrived at a grand arena. Crowds filled the stands, including the bandaged soldiers drawn by curiosity. In the VIP seats sat Brower, Seiga, King Arcana, and the headmaster, all ready to witness the duel. In the arena, Ran's energy was already boiling over with impatience. Sansui had a quiet word with Brower, wondering aloud if he was being unfair, since he sometimes felt he resembled Ran more than he liked. Brower quickly reassured him they weren't alike at all, easing the weight on his mind before the fight began. Ran arrogantly chose to fight barehanded, daring Sansui to stay alert. Sansui figured the choice would only make it easier to show the gap between them. Far from the noise of the arena, Rain silently prayed for her father's safety as the crowd's roar grew louder with the 2 fighters facing off. The tension rose. Ran seethed at Sansui's calm. Her friends cheered her on from the sidelines, worry still gnawing at them. Seiga, watching from the stands, wondered what strategy Sansui would use, while Ekisach warned him never to take his eyes off the man. Ran's friends kept shouting for her to stay patient and not let emotion take over. She snapped back sharply before bursting forward at an impossible speed. She moved so fast that even King Arcana and the headmaster couldn't track her. To untrained eyes, she seemed to vanish entirely. Aiming for a blind spot, Ran struck fast, certain that a motionless Sansui could only see what was right in front of him. But just as the hit was about to land, something unexpected happened. Sansui released a burst of internal force that sent Ran flying back. Landing steadily, she began to sense something about her opponent's ability. Sansui gave a subtle signal of what was coming next. Ran suddenly froze, unable to move a muscle. The crowd, including Sega, were left baffled. A harsh truth surfaced: no matter how strong a berserker was, they could never match the true speed of a real flash step technique. Ran chose to play defense, ready to intercept whatever came next. The shift surprised her allies. It was the first time she'd ever hesitated to charge forward, but to Sansui that kind of thinking was far too shallow. Standing calm, he goaded her into action. Provoked, Ran exploded forward at full speed, certain she'd finally spotted an opening. Her body reacted instantly, moving as fast as she could to land one clean hit, pouring everything into making sure it wouldn't miss. But right after she leapt, something felt wrong. Despite closing the distance, Sansui still felt impossibly far away. Frustration crept in as the gap between them refused to close. It felt like a trap. She realized he was repeating the same move, a pattern that left her cornered and powerless in the middle of the arena. In that instant, she knew she'd been baited. A heavy blow sent her flying, leaving her stunned and in pain for underestimating the situation. Watching from the sidelines, Town explained that Ran had been manipulated into believing her attack would land. Her hesitation at the last second had sealed her defeat. If she hadn't pulled back, Sansui might have actually been thrown off balance. Unlike her, though, Sansui never showed a flicker of doubt in his movements. In a calm but cutting tone, Sansui warned that holding back against him would only make things harder. He decided to stop pulling his punches and teach her the hard way, a remark that lit a fire of rage across Ran's face. The stands fell silent. King Arcana, the headmaster, and the other knights could only watch as Sansui completely dominated the fight, the gap between them painfully clear to everyone present. Ran's breathing grew ragged. The relentless barrage left no room for her regeneration to keep up. She felt humiliated by his offer to teach her, like she was some amateur who knew nothing. She remembered always being the one to beat down anyone who tried to lecture her. Now she tried to focus harder, studying every detail of his movement, hoping to see through his strategy. Sansui pointed out that overthinking an opponent's next move only limited your own options. The doubt that followed was written clearly on her face. Without wasting time, he leapt in for another strike. Ran tried to read the motion carefully, ready to counter at the right moment, but his speed and precision were beyond anything she expected. Another hard kick landed. Sansui asked, almost mockingly, whether trying to outsmart him was proving difficult. Ran hit the ground and skidded across it. Watching from the stands, Town and Sega realized their gift for reading the future or predicting movement meant nothing against him. Every strategy they relied on suddenly felt useless. To Sansui, it was simple. The body just had to move on instinct the moment an opening appeared. He caught Ran effortlessly, which only made her angrier, feeling like she was being toyed with. Light on his feet, Sansui dodged her counter and used the motion to flip the position entirely. Ran, thrown off balance, could only watch in shock as he took complete control of her body. Panicking, she tried to break free, but Sansui was faster. Another clean kick sent her flying again before she could mount any real resistance. Town explained the core of swordsmanship once more: keep your view wide, never stop observing, never stop thinking, and trust the training you've put in. Sega listened, disbelief written across his face. Watching from afar, Rain simply concluded that the man really was the strongest swordsman who ever lived. In the arena, Sansui looked down at Ran and asked if she still believed patience had no place in a fight. Amid the dust, Ran knelt, breathing hard, biting back fury. Gritting her teeth, humiliated, she demanded Sansui stop toying with her. She tried to rise with what strength she had left, but a light touch was all it took to put her down again. With just one casual press of a finger, Sansui sent her back to the ground, looking at her without much emotion, as if wondering what else she thought she could do. The sheer one-sidedness of it left King Arcana and the headmaster stunned in the stands. Once he eased off, Ran went limp. Silence settled over the arena as Sansui began walking away. Then he stopped, turned, and asked if she wanted to keep going. That's when when something in Ran finally broke, the truth she'd been denying caught up to her. An unbridgeable gap in strength stood plainly in front of her. Next to Sansui, she felt small, insignificant. Voice shaking, eyes empty, she finally admitted defeat. Her surrender echoed through the arena, stirring an uproar from the crowd who hadn't expected this ending. Ran stayed on her knees, unable to meet anyone's eyes with the same arrogance as before. Seeing their teacher like this, Suji and the other students sprinted toward the center of the arena, faces full of worry. Holding back tears, the students tried to comfort Ran, visibly broken. In the VIP stands, shock still lingered. King Arcana and the nobles sat speechless, one of them finally praising how incredible Sansui's performance had been. Staying humble, Sansui knelt and thanked them for the compliment. But his clean, total victory stirred jealousy among the crowd, envy toward House Sopid for having a swordsman this flawless under their wing. Town approached eagerly, insisting Sansui truly deserved the title of strongest swordsman. The praise only met more humility. Sansui felt he was still far from perfect, nowhere close to his master's level. That excessive modesty irritated Ran's students, like his win meant nothing to him. Town found the answer motivating anyway. Sansui simply nodded, promising to keep training harder. Walking the arena corridor with Brower, Sansui got another reminder. Brower warned that being too humble could hurt the reputation of the family head he served. Sansui apologized, though Brower insisted she wasn't the one who deserved it. Town caught up from behind, still impressed by how Sansui had handled a berserker-type fighter. Sansui explained casually, the trick was striking right when the opponent's body locked up from using everything they had just to stop moving. For anyone who couldn't control themselves, all it took was one precise hit at the right moment. He doubted Town or Brower would fall for something that simple, though they both admitted seeing it up close was still unsettling. Town remembered their own fight had a similar shape. Sansui had been the one to teach him the value of observation. Sansui added that fighting someone who relied purely on raw talent without real observational skill wasn't something he enjoyed. Honestly, he said, he preferred fighting Town far more. Town felt genuinely honored until the conversation was cut short by heavy footsteps approaching, putting Brower and Town on guard. A group of bandaged fighters approached, clearly inspired by the earlier match, asking if Sansui had enjoyed it too. Without hesitation, they all bowed deeply, begging him to take them on as students. Meanwhile, in the arena's waiting room, the mood was bleak. Ran sat slumped, replaying her humiliating loss. She felt like nothing she did would ever be enough to beat someone that strong. Her students stood around her, unsure what to say. Sunny and the others walked in. Sharply, she asked if Ran planned to just give up and go home, calling out her defeatist attitude and daring her to say it to her students' faces. Ran clicked her tongue in irritation, but Sega stepped in to calm things down. He admitted he couldn't beat Sansui either, but the people around him were what pushed him to grow stronger. He reminded Ran that plenty of people still believed in her. Happen spoke up too, asking if Ran wanted to keep being a loser in Sansui's eyes. She warned that if Ran kept wallowing in despair, the people who supported her would suffer right along with her. The words cut deep. The pressure from her friends reignited something in Ran. She declared she hated this outcome and refused to let it end here. Watching the shift, the headmaster smiled, quietly grateful to Sansui. Thanks to him, Ran and the others had finally worked through whatever had been holding them back. In a quiet meeting room, King Arcana sat with the other officials in a formal atmosphere. He gave Sopid a probing look, asking what exactly was going on with him. Sopid, calm but guarded, said there was nothing worth worrying about, even though his expression suggested otherwise. His mind drifted to Sansui, remembering how humble the swordsman had been right after the big fight. Strange, seeing someone that powerful stay so grounded around others. With nothing left to argue, King Arcana moved the discussion along, asking if there'd been any complaints from citizens about the Berserker incident. Sopid assured him things were under control, with no complaints so far. The talk shifted to the people now training under Sansui. Hapen's father was shocked to learn Sansui had agreed to take them on as students. Sopid explained it was time they took on new responsibilities, especially with Brower soon to become Sansui's wife, a change that meant they could no longer serve as the younger Sopid's personal guards. Depending on how the training went, Sopid planned to eventually make Sansui the official sword instructor, an idea Hapen's father approved with a quiet nod. King Arcana then turned to the matter of Ran and the 4 other rare magic users. It came out that that a curse had already been placed on Ran as insurance. If she went berserk again, she'd be subdued instantly. The 4 other magic users had agreed to cooperate, and the basics of their rare magic had already been taught to Sega. The king felt relieved hearing this, while elsewhere, Ran was leading her group, including Happin's sister, toward some destination. The king's focus shifted to the mystery of Tempera Village. He sighed, surprised the village had been within his own territory the whole time. Sopid noted that its extreme isolation explained why it had gone unnoticed for so long. Though there were no plans yet to formally bring the village under the kingdom, King Arcana hoped to build good relations with them, given that it reportedly held 10 bloodlines of rare magic. The headmaster, present at the meeting, agreed that this kind of diplomacy could benefit everyone. But King Arcana recalled a story Ekisach had once told about how the villagers had once managed to corner the legendary lightning sword Suiboku himself. Happin's father was stunned, hardly believing anyone could corner someone that strong. The king added that Suiboku had still fought them off despite being wounded. A heavy silence settled over the room, everyone left wondering just how powerful this man named Suiboku really was. Meanwhile, Ran's group kept climbing a brutally steep slope. The terrain wore Happine and Tezuka down until they were gasping for breath. They began to understand why this village had never been found. The path was buried in unforgiving wilderness. Sunny tried to cheer them on, saying they were close, with a light jab that their exhaustion just showed how little they trained. Happine and Tezuka groaned inwardly, realizing they still had further to go. Through the fatigue, Sega walked deep in thought, making Ran wonder what was on his mind. Sega had been turning over Suiboku's reputation the way Sansui always spoke of him. His curiosity was building, wanting to know just how strong the legend really was. Their march finally stopped when Ran announced they'd arrived. Tempera Village stretched out before them, quiet but carrying a strange weight in the air. The moment they stepped inside, something felt off. The silence was absolute, with no sign of life anywhere. Happine and Tezuka wondered if the village was always this empty. Even Kazuno found it strange there were usually people around. Suddenly, a jarring vision struck Sega. In vivid detail, he saw Suiboku covered in blood, kneeling while gripping Ekisach's blade, surrounded by attackers closing in. His wounds looked severe, the scene gruesome. The vision intensified. Sega could feel the rage and overwhelming power surging from Suiboku's body. With one earth-shaking roar, the swordmaster unleashed a devastating technique that tore through everything around him. The ground cracked and buildings crumbled under the force. Sega snapped back to reality, drenched in cold sweat. Happine, alarmed by the sudden change in him, asked what was wrong. Sega just stared, still trying to process what he'd seen. A middle-aged man in traditional clothing appeared, introducing himself as the leader of the turtle shell fist style. He explained that the place had just shown a residual echo of past rage, a trace of the one they called the ferocious god. They all gathered in a large traditional hall, where the village leader sat calmly, checking again that Sega had fully recovered from the shock of the vision. Sega hesitantly explained he'd seen Suiboku use some extraordinary technique while wielding Ekisach. The explanation sparked curiosity from Tezuka and Happine, who wondered why it had surfaced so suddenly and what exactly Sega had witnessed. Sunny and Ran guessed it was a fragment of their own past. The village leader confirmed it with a slow nod, explaining that their bloodline carried something called Star Blood, a unique martial ability tied to the turtle shell fist, letting its user sense both future and past. Sega began to understand that the power he just experienced resembled foresight. The leader then told a story from 2,000 years ago, when the village's mercenary trade was passed down through generations. One day, a lone swordsman came to challenge them all. The entire village banded together and managed to corner him, but that was only the beginning of a tragedy. Cornered and desperate, Suiboku had unleashed his true sage technique. Ekisach explained, a force powerful enough to shake the sky and split the earth, wiping out the entire village within minutes. Sunny flinched at the thought of how terrifying that must have been. To Sega, Suiboku now looked less like a man and more like a war god thirsting for blood. The idea that he could do something on that scale was beyond anything Sunny and the others could grasp, but the elder cut the conversation short, steering them back to the matter at hand. Without making excuses, Ran dropped to her knees before the elder. Her followers quickly followed, a deep, sincere apology for everything that had happened. Even with Rand's apology, the elder felt it came far too late. He told them to take a good look at the village's silence. That was the reason no one had come to greet them. Sunny realized then that the villagers were deliberately hiding, unwilling to have anything more to do with them. Despite Rand's insistence on making things right, the elder's decision was final. He declared the village was formally cutting ties with the Kingdom of Arcana. The blunt statement left Sega and Sunny speechless, the door to any cooperation now firmly shut. There was no changing the village's choice to isolate itself. With his head bowed, the elder handed over a stack of old books as a parting gift. Sega accepted the secret texts with mixed feelings, manuals on the tortoise-shell fist technique, along with martial arts records belonging to the 4 girls with him. The elder called it his final gift before ordering them all to leave. Time passed and the scene shifted to the quiet school garden. Sansui stood watching the students train, lost in thought like something heavy weighed on his mind. Walking nearby with Brower, Rain noticed something off about her father. Bluntly, she said he didn't look like he was having any fun at all. She went further, criticizing Brower's decision about the marriage, frustrated that their relationship seemed stuck with nothing moving forward. Sansui turned, confused at the sound of Rain's outburst. Just then, Dewey appeared from a distance, watching the scene with a knowing smile, muttering something about what was unfolding. In his usual light-hearted way, Dewey teased Sansui and Brower for being so hopeless that they'd managed to upset Rain. Rain nodded along, feeling backed up as she cornered the 2 flustered adults. The casual mood broke the moment Dewey dropped his next announcement. Grinning, he revealed they'd all be heading off to meet Brower's parents. The sudden news left Sansui, Brower, and Rain stunned, none of them ready for the new chapter waiting ahead. The road was quiet, broken only by the creak of carriage wheels on packed dirt. Inside, Sansui stared out the window, still wondering how everything had happened so fast. It started when Dew suggested they visit Brower's parents since the wedding was coming up and family protocol demanded it. Sansui felt bad about it too, since it meant dumping all his work on his new student Toon. Inside the carriage, Rain wouldn't let it stay quiet for long. She kept pushing Sansui to say something about the woman sitting across from him. Brower sat there looking elegant, nothing like her usual self. Brower, blushing, asked in a hesitant voice what Sansui thought of her new look. Sansui just sat there, speechless, completely thrown by the transformation, while Rain watched their reaction with bright, eager eyes. Brower usually wore her knight's uniform and gear to impress him. This time she dropped that look entirely for a dress. Rain groaned, annoyed that Sansui couldn't muster more than silence. Brower admitted she wasn't really comfortable. She'd worn men's clothes for so long that the dress felt foreign. But seeing how happy Rain was and how much the girl had been looking forward to this, she wore it without complaint. Sansui tried to get a grip on himself. As a former hermit, he didn't think he should get too worked up, even though he knew how lucky he was to have a fiancée as beautiful as Brower. His flat reaction only annoyed Rain more, who accused his coldness of making Brower doubt her own looks. Sansui laughed it off, reminding them he was a 500-year-old man worried about looking strange to Brower's family. At least Brower hadn't told them his real age yet. Both of them knew this marriage was a decision from the Sopid family they couldn't refuse. The tension crept back in as the wedding's reality set in. Brower looked uneasy, unsure what to do once they arrived, while Sansui tried to steel himself into someone dependable. Even Rain, sitting in the corner, seemed to feel the weight of it. Meanwhile, at the Wynn estate, the mood was formal. Semperwin, Brower's father, sat in his study with the rest of the family, holding an important letter that had just arrived from the ruler of Sopid. The news landed hard. Brower's mother, Ket Wynn, and her siblings Shet, Heather, and Laya were stunned to hear Brower was coming home to get married. Their reactions ranged from disbelief to outright excitement at having their sister back. Semper explained the marriage came straight from their lord at Brower's own request. Given everything Brower had sacrificed since childhood, the family was glad to accept it. But he gave a stern warning, especially to Heather, not to cause trouble or act hostile toward Brower's future husband. Heather agreed, though her face said otherwise. Outside the room, the mood stayed a little awkward for some of the family. They knew a new addition to the family would change things. Heather complained about always being treated like a kid, even though she wanted a say in her sister's wedding. Shet told her not to ruin the good mood. They moved on to talking about Brower's famous fiancé, the so-called baby-faced swordsman, Sansui Shirokuro. Laya tried to calm Heather down, who was clearly itching reaching for something, Heather admitted she was only thinking about the Wynn family's future as the next head of the household. She felt she had to be careful about who got pulled into their circle. Laya promised to keep Heather from doing anything reckless that might hurt someone's feelings. As for herself, she couldn't wait to meet the legendary Sword Saint in person. The carriage finally pulled up outside the Wynn's grand estate. Inside, the nerves peaked. Sansui worried his clothes weren't proper enough, Rain worried she'd come across as a strange kid, and Brower felt her heart pound, finally home after so long. The moment the carriage stopped, Semper and Ket Wynn rushed out with open arms, overcome with emotion. Tears fell freely at the sight of their daughter home again. Their warm welcome melted away the earlier tension. After embracing Brower, Semper turned his attention to the man standing beside her. With a polite but searching look, he guessed correctly that this had to be Sansui. Semper introduced himself warmly and shook Sansui's hand. Sansui returned the courtesy, apologizing for their late arrival. Rain jumped in with her own introduction, breaking the stiffness in the air. "Welcome to our home," they said warmly as the carriage came to a stop. The man in the kimono studied the grand building ahead while the little girl beside him whispered that everyone here seemed really nice. He just nodded, hoping the visit would go smoothly. The family gathering began in the spacious living room. Brower formally introduced her fiancé, asking everyone to welcome him as part of the family. The room stayed a little stiff. A blonde young man sitting across from them just stared in silence, sharp-eyed, making the man in the kimono shift awkwardly and force a thin smile. The conversation turned to how young the man in the kimono looked, exactly as the rumors said. His sister, a girl with a ribbon in her hair, looked confused. Their parents, on the other hand, laughed proudly, impressed that a swordsman this skilled could still look so young. Uncomfortable with the praise, the man finally decided to come clean about his age. A little embarrassed, he explained he was a practitioner of a rare technique called sage arts, which had the side effect of keeping his skin looking young. The confession made the woman beside him gasp, stunned he just blurted out the secret like that. He went on, a little awkwardly, admitting he was actually much older than the blonde man and the girl with the ribbon sitting across from him. The blonde man froze, realizing the man's incredible strength probably came from all those extra years of experience. The girl with the ribbon started imagining what other kinds of magic might let someone turn into a giant monster. The couple marveled at how vast the world of magic really was. But in the middle of their wonder, the woman in the dark dress who'd been quiet until then stood up and stepped closer. Her stare was intense enough to choke the air out of the room. Without a word, the woman in the dark dress reached out and pinched the kimono-wearing man's cheek. Everyone in the room froze, shocked by how rude and out of nowhere it was. The woman started shaking like she just touched something that wasn't quite human skin. She kept muttering in disbelief, her face flushed, while the man could only sit there baffled with no idea how to react. It turned out she was simply jealous of how smooth his skin was, far smoother than her own father's. Things spiraled further when the girl with the ribbon wanted to touch it too. The blonde man buried his face in his hands, mortified by his sister's loss of control. Chaos took over the living room. The woman in the dark dress seemed to have completely lost it, obsessed with the secret behind that smooth skin. The man begged to be let go while his fiancée could only watch, pale-faced. He stood up quickly and apologized over and over, blaming the disturbance on travel exhaustion. His father tried to smooth things over, but his fiancée was furious that he'd been careless enough to set off such an over-the-top reaction. To the man in the kimono, the obsessed look in that woman's eyes felt genuinely terrifying. Ironically, the parents thought their kids were just bonding, ignoring his very real cries for help from behind the sofa. Behind closed doors, the blonde man and his younger sister talked it over with serious faces. If this wasn't handled soon, they worried the family's harmony could fall apart over something so trivial. They needed a way to calm their older sister down. Inside the room, the woman in the dark dress was still trembling with envy. The blonde man felt the weight of it all, lamenting his role as the future head of the family who somehow had to deal with his sister's skin obsession. Out of pure desperation, he begged his father to let him take over as ruler of the territory early, hoping to escape babysitting his sister. His father just sighed, clearly not convinced his son was ready for that responsibility yet. Dinner time arrived at the grand estate. A lavish meal was laid out on the long table lit by candlelight. Despite the formal setting, the mood between everyone remained strange and unsettled. Tension still hung over the dinner table. The woman in the dark dress kept shooting sharp, deadly looks until her sister warned her not to cause another scene in front of their parents. The man in the kimono managed only a stiff smile, finding the whole atmosphere unbearable. Their father finally raised his glass, inviting everyone to toast their daughter's return and bless the upcoming marriage. Amid the clinking glasses, the man in the kimono quietly reflected on how all this chaos traced back to his status as a sage. The little girl at the table pouted, thinking this trip, which was supposed to be a honeymoon, had turned out pretty miserable. Then everyone's attention shifted to the sound of crying coming from the end of the table. It turned out the mother was sobbing, overwhelmed with emotion. The father quickly apologized for their unusual behavior, explaining that his wife was simply overjoyed and relieved their daughter had come home safe after so long. Brawa had real magical talent the Sopid family recognized when they hired her as Lady Dewey's personal guard. But being a guard meant failure wasn't an option. Her father knew that in an emergency, Brawa could lose her life doing her job. Hearing that, Brawa hung her head, embarrassed that her focus had been entirely on Sansui. Her father admitted the fear he'd been carrying, that he might never see his daughter again, let alone watch her get married. Her mother gently added that she believed Brawa would be safe now, with Sansui always there to protect her. At the far end of the table, the blonde man sat with his head down, full of regret. He finally understood what his father had really been trying to tell him, that he'd spent all this time chasing recognition as the next head of the family without ever grasping the weight of that responsibility. His mother added gently that she believed Brawa would make it through safely, since Sansui would always be there watching over her. Full of gratitude, the parents wanted to thank him properly. They asked him to keep taking care of Brawa from now on. The dinner warmed up after that, full of laughter and clinking glasses. While sipping his drink, the father praised Brawa as an extraordinary daughter and his most precious treasure. Then his gaze sharpened toward his son. To him, the boy was pathetic. The blonde man apologized, admitting he'd forgotten that his success running the territory was thanks to his sister risking her life. Suddenly, the old man slammed the table. He insisted that talent wasn't what mattered most in running a territory. What mattered was sincerity in dealing with problems. If a leader acted arrogant toward his people, they wouldn't hesitate to abandon him. Sansui smiled watching it all unfold, happy that these remarkable people would soon be his family. But in the middle of the warmth, something felt off. A bad feeling hit him out of nowhere. What was this feeling? Sansui went on high alert, sensing the presence of something powerful. Brawa and Rain noticed the shift in his expression and started to worry too. Meanwhile, at the academy training grounds, sword practice was still going strong. Sunny watched closely as the other students kept swinging their swords with everything they had. Sunny chatted casually with the blonde-haired girl. They talked about Sansui and the others off visiting Brawa's parents. To her, it was normal for a newly engaged couple to make that kind of formal visit. Off to the side, Saiga was a nervous wreck, knowing his own turn to meet Sunny's parents was coming up soon. While they talked, a few of the other girls decided to stay behind in the village to keep training, not wanting to keep relying on everyone else. They promised to come back stronger. Sunny smiled proudly and said she'd be looking forward to it. Real determination showed on the girls' faces. Sunny clenched her fists, telling herself she needed to get stronger too for everyone's sake. Watching her fire him up, Saiga felt the same pull. He vowed that no matter how small the progress, he had to close the gap toward Sansui's level. The other girls cheered him on to keep pushing. Day gave way to night. The academy grounds, lively just hours before, fell quiet under a calm moon. In one of the dorm rooms, a lamp was still burning. Saiga lay in bed reading a book, his mind drifting to whether he could really become stronger than he was now. He thought back to the crushing loss he'd taken against Sansui. Even after picking up new magic since then, beating that man still felt impossible. He also remembered the promise he'd made to her not to fight Sansui again. Saiga had let go of any serious urge to compete, but deep down, some small part of him still wanted one more shot at crossing swords. Before long, Saiga drifted off, snoring softly. Outside, though, the weather turned ominous. Lightning cracked across the sky with a deafening roar, splitting the night above the kingdom's fortress. In the middle of of the storm, a mysterious long-haired man appeared. Cold-eyed and standing perfectly still, he gripped a long spear as the rain poured down around him. That image carried Saiga straight into an important meeting with the king and his top officials. With a serious expression, he reported what he'd witnessed. He knew it sounded hard to believe, but it was the terrifying truth he'd seen with his own eyes. Worry spread through the room. The blonde man explained that Sansui was currently away visiting Brawa's family. The problem was no one knew if they could get him back before something disastrous happened. The black-haired man listening could only stay quiet, uneasy about facing this alone. They could call on Decias in an emergency, but for now, he'd have to move forward without backup. Up on the castle wall, the black-haired man was startled to spot a cloud of dust rising in the distance. Someone was riding hard toward the gate. The castle guards noticed the mysterious rider too. Out of breath, the man shouted that something had happened at Caputo. The rider turned out to be Ukyau. Panic-stricken, he shouted the bad news: Domino had been attacked. Worse, the sacred relic, the Vajra, had been stolen. Ukyau warned that the man who'd taken it by force was now heading straight for this castle at full speed. The night grew tense as the carriage wheels rumbled fast across the road. The crossed sword emblem on the carriage door bore silent witness to the danger building in the region. The door burst open without warning. The blonde-haired woman blurted out an apology for the sudden intrusion. Ukyau, startled at the unannounced arrival, immediately demanded to know why they'd come. The black-haired man explained right away he just had a nightmare that felt like a prophecy. Ukyau froze at the mention of a prophetic dream. Given that something terrible had actually happened, he asked everyone to stay calm and hear the full explanation. It began on a quiet night. A castle that should have been safe turned into a slaughterhouse. Amid smoke and rubble, soldiers lay scattered, helpless. Standing there was a stranger with long, wavy hair gripping a long staff, his stare ice cold. The surviving soldiers tried to hold their ground, telling everyone behind them to back away. Furious and afraid, they demanded to know who this stranger was and why he'd attacked the castle, leaving so many dead. The man barely spoke. With one quick swing of his weapon, he sent fully armored soldiers flying like they weighed nothing. Not one of them could withstand the force of his attack. Once he'd taken down every guard, the man finally introduced himself as Fuke. He claimed to be a sage from a distant land, forged by 4,500 years of brutal training. His arrival in these 8 kingdoms wasn't random. Fuke stated flatly that he'd come to kill his foolish junior disciple, Suiboku. The confession left everyone listening, including the blonde woman and Ukyau, stunned and tense. Fuke knew they held a sacred relic. He explained he needed it to track Suiboku down. Getting that item was non-negotiable if he wanted to finish what he'd come to do. With a menacing stare, Fuke laid out his terms. If they refused to hand over the Vajra, he wouldn't hesitate to kill everyone and take it by force. Ukyau and the woman beside him froze, grasping just how serious the threat was. Back in the present, inside the room, the weight of it all settled in. Ukyau bowed his head and apologized, regretting that they'd had no choice but to give Fuke the Vajra. The nun beside him tried to reassure him, saying there was no point fighting a sage they couldn't possibly match. The conversation turned to Suiboku. They asked Xax if she'd ever heard about Suiboku's past training partners. Despite having been by his side for over 1,000 years, she admitted Suiboku never once talked about his past. That made things even more complicated, especially with a sage who trained longer than Suiboku now wielding the Vajra. The black-haired man realized that if someone that powerful used the Vajra, Domino and Arcana could both be wiped out. In the middle of the despair, a little girl cheerfully suggested calling Suiboku's student, Sansui, to deal with the monster, since they were fellow disciples. Unfortunately, the blonde woman reminded them Sansui was on vacation and not around. Their only remaining hope was calling in a Pandora user. They'd already tried reaching one, but with the storm closing in outside, the black-haired man realized help might not arrive in time. With a serious look, he decided they'd have to face this on their own. He resolved to do his best. Hopping Sansui and Suiboku were watching from somewhere far away. Meanwhile, elsewhere, inside a moving carriage, a man named Shun was talking with a long-haired woman. A kid in the carriage found the whole situation hilarious, which Shun immediately shot down with a sour look. Shun sighed, hoping his presence would actually be useful in this mess. The woman beside him, though, looked completely confident. Laughing softly, she teased him, saying that as long as Shun was with her, even someone as strong as Suiboku wouldn't stand a chance against them. Somewhere else, Sansui was enjoying time with his family as a storm rolled in. That calm vanished the moment he sensed sensed a familiar aura. Staring sharply at the darkening sky, he realized the thing he'd been dreading had finally arrived. The tension spiked the instant the dark-haired man sensed another powerful presence nearby. It turned out that besides himself and his master, there was another sage here. In front of him, a group stood ready with their weapons drawn. The young man in a school uniform gripped his oversized sword while the others around him braced themselves, sensing this opponent was no ordinary threat. But the dark-haired man had no interest in ordinary people or the affairs of this nation. To him, they were just mortals who'd be gone soon enough. With contempt in his voice, he warned them to know their place and get out of his sight. With an intimidating glare, he introduced himself as Fuke. He'd come for one reason, to kill Suiboku, his junior disciple, whom he considered a disgrace to all sages. Wasting time on people like them felt beneath him. At the name, the young man in the school uniform stiffened. He claimed a connection to Suiboku since he was currently training under one of Suiboku's own students. Fuke looked mildly surprised at the unexpected claim. With firm resolve, the young man declared he wouldn't let Fuke go any further into the kingdom of Arcana. The challenge only made Fuke laugh coldly. If the kid really was tied to one of Suiboku's followers, he decided he might as well kill him too. Fuke swore he'd wipe out anyone connected to Suiboku without exception. Seeing how dangerous things were getting, a chain-armored man beside the young man stepped forward, ready to take point against the sage. The man in chain armor spoke calmly, saying he had no interest in doing anything reckless or fighting to the death. But if fate demanded it, he wouldn't hesitate for a second to cut Fuke down right here. Fuke brushed off the threat, asking if he was really sure he wanted to go first. From what Fuke could tell, this man looked like the most skilled and capable one in the whole group. The man introduced himself as Town, an ordinary swordsman. Without wasting time, he charged forward and unleashed his technique, Omnidance, surrounding Fuke with afterimages from every direction. Town moved with incredible speed, hunting for an opening to land a cut, but Fuke, completely calm, blocked every strike with his spear. Town's impressive speed still wasn't enough to break through the sage's defense. It didn't take Fuke long to counterattack. He used his Spirit Blade technique, Cross Slash, a powerful crossing strike that left the young man and the girl beside him stunned by how devastating it was. The shockwave from Fuke's spear sent the whole area into disarray. The young man in the uniform could only stare, frozen by just how terrifying this level of power really was. The clash of weapons kept echoing as Town fought with everything he had to hold off Fuke's relentless spear strikes. Cornered as he was, Town kept trying to match the aggressive rhythm of his opponent's attacks. Amid the sparks flying from their clashing weapons, Town muttered that he knew full well he was outmatched by the sage. But knowing that gap existed, he made it clear he had no intention of retreating, not even one step. Town stayed focused, determined not to miss a single move and to respond instantly, just like he'd seen Sansui do in battle. Then Fuke vanished from Town's sight and reappeared instantly behind him using Dance of the Detached Back. A brutal strike slammed into the ground, kicking up a violent cloud of dust and sending Town flying. The young man in uniform shouted Town's name in panic. Even bleeding and injured, Town managed a satisfied smile. He knew Fuke was far stronger, but he was proud he'd at least managed to land one hit on the sage. Unfortunately, Fuke had eaten a mystical ginseng root that gave him incredible regeneration. The small wound he'd taken closed up almost instantly. Town realized the only way to win was to inflict damage faster than Fuke's body could heal. Seeing Town running out of steam, the young man in the school uniform decided to take over. With full courage, he charged in, clashing his oversized sword directly against Fuke's spear, kicking off a new stage in this life-or-death fight. The long-haired man scoffed, dismissing the attack as a rookie's foolish move. But the young man in front of him moved fast, blocking the powerful blow with an incredibly solid defensive stance. It turned out to be the cross-block technique from the Jade Sect's weapon style. The long-haired man's eyes went wide. How could his strike be stopped with bare hands? This advanced martial technique let its user harden their limbs enough to deflect any attack. Before his opponent could recover from the shock, the young man shifted into the liquor dance style from the drunken sect, conjuring a psychic sphere around the area. Anyone caught inside this invisible barrier would lose their balance completely. Seeing the opening, his friends friends cheered, sensing victory was within reach. Suddenly, a wolf-faced man lunged forward at incredible speed, landing a clean hit that made the long-haired man groan in pain. The wolf-faced man unleashed a pure sacred power called Royal Divine Possession, a berserker technique that multiplied his strength several times over. Their opponent was now truly cornered, unable to mount any real resistance. A massive explosion hit the long-haired man square in the face, making him scream as searing energy tore through him without mercy. Giving him no time to breathe, the wolf-faced man teamed up with a short-haired woman using a technique called exploding venom. Every touch from their hands or feet could trigger a chain explosion, systematically tearing down his defenses. The long-haired man rose with boiling rage, surrounded by terrifying flames, but something felt wrong. He wasn't actually burning. It was just a fake wall of fire, an illusion from the shadow mist technique meant to throw off his attention and create a fatal opening. Sure enough, he fell right into the trap. A woman with long blonde hair drove a hard punch straight into his face, shouting that he just walked into their snare. The long-haired man staggered backward from the blow. The blonde woman laughed, satisfied, taunting him over whether that was really all he had. Watching from a distance, the young man realized she was fighting in dead serious mode. The long-haired man searched for an opening, waiting for the blonde woman to drop her guard so he could strike back with a delayed counter. But his plan fell apart completely. The counterattack came faster than he expected. She wasn't fighting alone, she'd coordinated perfectly with the rest of her team. A hard kick landed on his body again. Her fighting style had grown far more flexible and lethal after all the brutal battles she'd been through. The wolf-faced man squared up again, insisting that people grow stronger by learning from their losses. He raised his weapon high, gathering an enormous surge of energy. In one fast motion, he grabbed the now helpless long-haired man and unleashed his ultimate technique, Maximum Comet, an unavoidable, devastating strike. A massive explosion followed, wiping out everything at the point of impact. The girls watching from the sidelines were in awe of Saiga, their ace, finally showing his teeth. As dust filled the air, a black-haired man told the woman beside him to start patching things up and dealing with the strange clouds overhead. But a bad feeling crept in. The woman shouted for everyone to stay alert, their enemy was still alive. The young man had felt relieved for a second, thinking they'd won before the fight even got serious. Then a heavy groan rose from the smoke. Everyone tensed, realizing the real fight might only be starting now. "Enough, I'm fighting for real now," the spear-wielding man roared, storming forward, consumed by rage. The young man in the school uniform could only stare, stunned at how fast the wounds on his opponent's body were closing up. How could a ginseng root produce healing on that level? Even a sage shouldn't be immune to magic fire, but the spear-wielder wasn't in the mood to explain. "Know your place," he snarled, swinging his weapon with deadly intent. This fight proved that once someone gives in to rage, their vision narrows and their thinking shuts down. That's exactly the kind of fatal opening that can't be fixed, the kind that makes a fighter lose faith in their own training because they can no longer read their opponent clearly. Internal energy release, foundation shaker. The spear wielder unleashed a devastating technique that made the air around him shudder violently. The girls watching from a distance could only cover their mouths in shock at the sheer scale of power on display. Moving almost too fast to see, he surged forward using the Altair flash step technique. His speed was on a completely different level, homing in on his opponent's blind spot with terrifying precision. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed as new arrivals reached the scene. A man in a suit, clearly exhausted, caught his breath while wondering if they'd made it in time to stop the chaos. The spear wielder froze the moment he saw the boy standing in front of him. "Suiboku," he muttered, his voice shaking. The boy looked at him with sad eyes and called him brother, a reunion clearly carrying the weight of a heavy past. The mood turned heavy without warning. Suiboku's face filled with anguish, and the sudden shift left everyone around him too stunned to react. Then, just as suddenly, he admitted the whole disaster was his fault. He apologized for dragging them into something this big, and before anyone could respond, he vanished using his lightstep technique. His sudden flight sent Saiga and the others into a panic. They called after him, trying to make sense of what he was planning. In the distance, Suiboku landed and dropped into a deep bow before his opponent, an act of humility and total surrender no one had expected. Saiga's group rushed to catch up, worry playing on their faces at a sight that felt deeply wrong. Confused, Saiga pressed for answers and the truth came out. Suiboku had been guiding them all along, the only one who understood what was really happening. More shocking still was what he intended now. now to give up his own life as the highest form of atonement. The news left everyone speechless. In despair, Suiboku begged to be finished off, insisting he had no will left to fight. The request only enraged his opponent, who took it as an insult and refused what he saw as a coward's way out. To him, honoring a warrior meant a fight to the death, not surrender without a struggle. Something in Suiboku stirred back to life at the challenge. He began gathering his energy, calling on a high-level alchemy technique, and his opponent smiled, pleased to finally see a spark of fighting spirit return. Not to be outdone, the challenger readied his ultimate Fuke-style technique, honed over 3,000 years. His entire existence had led to this one chance to duel and kill Suiboku. But Suiboku answered calmly that his opponent had misjudged everything, and unleashed a sacred technique of his own, a manifestation of clarity and enlightenment at its peak, an art so rare only those with extraordinary spiritual insight could ever master it. Saiga's friends watched from a distance, awed and unnerved, beginning to grasp just how much it must take to reach that level. This wasn't simple martial skill, it was the power to bend space, gravity, the very order of the world. No wonder those who reached its peak were seen as gods walking the earth. The real fight broke loose. The opponent charged with a roar, pouring every ounce of fury and ambition into a single strike, tearing a massive slab of earth into the sky, then driving its full weight down on Suiboku in a tectonic blow meant to crush anything beneath it. The explosion buried the area in thick dust. Through the haze, everyone shouted for Suiboku, certain he'd been swallowed by the wreckage. But the strike only grazed him. He dodged with barely a movement, leaving onlookers stunned that anyone could slip past death so calmly. Fuke, expecting the miss, pressed forward, chasing Suiboku as he weaved through the destruction, every strike meeting nothing but air while dust and stone flew from the force of the clash. Their speed had crossed into another league entirely. Suiboku felt the ground crack beneath them, the sheer pressure of the fight enough to shake the earth itself. Using his light step technique, Suiboku glided clear of a low strike aimed at his legs. But the fight wasn't only about dodging. In an instant the two collided, the impact flashing blinding light. Fuke gave him no room to breathe, firing off a volley of blade energy shaped like sharp thorns. Suiboku was forced to his knees just to hold steady under the barrage. Fuke looked furious, but Suiboku stayed calm, drawing on his inner energy, his control far more precise than his opponent expected. In a blink, Suiboku closed in with a needle-fast cutting technique drawn from acupuncture. Fuke reeled, caught off guard by the sudden counter, and the advantage shifted. Suiboku's glowing energy blade now leading the exchange. The fight exploded again at full speed, their light, lethal footwork colliding hard enough to send shockwaves across the beach. Fuke laughed through ragged breaths, impressed that Suiboku still had the nerve to weave in acupuncture techniques even in a fight to the death. To him, this was the duel he'd always wanted. From the boat, the onlookers could only stare. What they were watching was beyond anything human. Two war gods locked in a battle, too advanced for the mind to follow. Fuke sensed his moment to end it. He called out Suiboku's name as a slab of earth tore free into the air. 3,000 years had led to this. With real feeling, he asked if his brother was satisfied with how hard they'd fought, if the long wait had finally been worth it. He unleashed his ultimate move, 1,000 comets of heaven and earth. The slab he'd ripped free in his tornado plunged down like a shower of meteors aimed at everything below. He swore that no matter how strong Suiboku was, escaping this was impossible, and poured every ounce of his external energy into making sure this time would be different, that it would end here. Suiboku answered with something unexpected. With one hand, he casually hefted a massive boulder, a mountain-throwing technique that left Fuke stunned. He shrugged it off as nothing worth boasting about, then called on his 5 elements mountain technique. Fuke froze as crushing pressure closed in from every side. Fuke went down, pinned to the ground by some invisible weight, groaning at how a mere tectonic technique could carry power this absurd. Seeing him helpless, Suiboku mocked him, calling him pathetic and daring him to put up a real fight. If Fuke wanted to lecture him, he said, he'd have to get stronger first. Fuke could only growl through his defeat, vowing that Suiboku would pay for his arrogance one day. But the truth was plain, senior disciple or not, Suiboku was the stronger of the two. It wasn't that Fuke lacked talent, Suiboku was simply on another level entirely. Even with a 500-year head start, Fuke was never going to match his genius. As the senior disciple, Fuke carried the guilt of having failed to stop Suiboku's dark ambitions in the past. Amid a raging storm, he'd sworn to stop his old companion by any means necessary, even if it meant killing someone he'd once been close to. 3,000 years had passed since Suiboku's disappearance, and Fuke had spent every one of them training without rest. He'd finally unlocked his highest secret technique, dragon reincarnation, pure earth energy flooding into him, granting an undying body and a sage's endless power. With the planet's full strength seemingly in his grip, he felt untouchable. But even at his peak, his opponent was still Suiboku, and to Suiboku, all of that overwhelming power looked small, well within his control. Suiboku braced calmly as a violent tremor built in the distance. A massive strike falling from the sky headed straight for Noah's ship. Panic spread on board as everyone braced for the meteor to wipe them out. But a solid barrier held, and they were told to stay calm and just watch the duel. Nothing that small could break through Noah's defenses. Attention turned back to the fight as Suiboku called on his foundation shaker technique, and the two clashed again at blinding speed. Fuke realized every one of his killing blows was being dodged with ease, the gap between them painfully clear. Determination alone was never going to beat someone who truly understood the nature of power. Calmly, Suiboku told him to just stop. The request only enraged Fuke further. To him, it was one more insult, one more way of being written off as powerless. Glancing toward his friends on Noah's ship, Suiboku realized there was no other way out. Heavy-hearted, he resolved to end it himself, right there on the barren ground, to kill Fuke with his own hands as his final act of responsibility. Cornered, Fuke unleashed his ultimate sage technique, ultimate heavenly invocation, Lightning Emperor. A massive bolt of lightning crashed down with devastating force, light so blinding it forced everyone to look away. He was certain that at this range, this much power was more than enough to erase Suiboku completely. But Suiboku answered with eerie calm, calling on his own sage technique, Ultimate Energy Sword Invocation, a counter-strike that cut clean through everything Fuke threw at him. Suiboku's power was beyond comprehension. In the distance, people in palaces and grand estates could only stare as the dark clouds overhead twisted and churned unnaturally. Then, in an instant, he cleared the sky completely. Gripping heaven's blade, he stood revealed as someone who had surpassed heaven and earth, the single most revered figure in the realm. He compressed the air around him into a single perfect blade. To him, killing Fuke with his own hands was an act of mercy, sparing his brother from further suffering under Pandora's power. But Fuke, blinded by rage, saw it as something else entirely. In a blink, Suiboku closed the distance with flash step, too fast for Fuke to react before he was already there, delivering the finishing blow. The strike landed clean. Fuke went down, his body unable to take any more. The ground around him lay in ruins, marking the end of the senior disciple who'd chosen the wrong path. Cradling his dying brother, Suiboku whispered his regret, blaming himself for the tragedy. Through the moksha palm technique, he guided Fuke's soul beyond life and death toward peace and a true, final happiness. Tears fell along with a painful admission that he'd misjudged everything. Under a quiet, star-filled sky, a memory surfaced, the two of them sitting together on a silent cliff watching the night. Beside him, his companion had only sighed, teasing him for being too stubborn to ever learn. When he'd asked why he was always being bothered, the answer came back proud, as the older brother in training watching over him was simply the job. He tried to argue that the only real difference between them was who joined first, but that logic fell apart against what it meant to be an older brother looking out for someone. A quiet beat passed, then a small, honest smile, proof of just how strong the bond between them really was. The words still echoed, a half-joking warning not to get in his way during training, but the warmth of the memory faded fast, pulling him back to the present, kneeling alone on a barren, silent field. Trembling, forehead pressed to the ground, he gave his final respects. Beneath the blinding light, he offered a quiet prayer that the man he respected so deeply could finally rest in peace.